Welcome back, viewer. I hope you had a fulfilling day and are ready to retire for the night, because today I am going to take you through the great Chinese Empire, their beliefs, culture, gods, kingdoms, armies, myths, and much more. Find your cozy spot because you will be drifting before you know it. All right, let's get started. The origin of the Chinese people, despite countless years of research, exploration, and debate, continues to remain a mystery veiled in time. No definitive answer exists as to who they originally were or where they truly came from. What little evidence we have suggests that they did not spring from the soil of the land they would one day call China, but rather that they arrived there from some distant place. Even within Chinese tradition itself, there is a strong belief that their ancestors came from the West. When we first glimpse their story through the lens of early history, we do not see a people comfortably rooted in a homeland long occupied by generations. Instead, what appears before us is a picture of pioneers, outsiders battling nature and the unknown. They were not at ease in the land, for it was not yet their own. These early settlers were seen wrestling with wild animals, hacking their way through thick and tangled forests, and clashing with the native peoples who already lived there, slowly pushing them back to claim the land. Their journey was one of conquest and survival, not one of peaceful continuity. Many theories have been proposed over time to explain the beginnings of the Chinese race. Among these, there was once the belief that they were autochthonous, that they were born from the very earth of China, and that their civilization had blossomed there independently. For a time, this idea held influence, offering a romantic view of China as a cradle of indigenous progress. However, as time passed and more evidence was gathered, the most respected scholars came to view this theory as unsound. What replaced it was a more complex and compelling hypothesis drawn from the growing field of sinology, the study of Chinese culture, history, and language. This new line of research pointed to a very different origin, possibly rooted in ancient Acadia, a region in Mesopotamia known for being one of the world's first civilizations. This possibility opens up a vivid picture. Long ago, perhaps as early as the 3rd millennium BCE, a group of people may have begun a long migration eastward. These people may have carried with them not just physical belongings, but also early forms of writing, agricultural practices, mythologies, and systems of governance that would later take unique shape in the East. Their journey would have spanned mountains, rivers, and deserts, possibly over many generations, until they eventually reached the valleys and plains of what is now China. There, their knowledge and energy would be tested against the wild, untamed environment and the existing tribal groups who already inhabited the region. Rather than quietly assimilate, these early settlers carved out a place for themselves through sheer persistence. They cleared vast woodlands, tamed rivers, built early settlements, and shaped the land until it could support growing communities. Over time, these pioneering people laid the groundwork for what would become a vast and ancient civilization. Although the specific names of their original homeland, their first leaders, or the paths they took may be lost to history, the legacy of their arrival remains etched in the cultural memory of China. Thus, the story of the Chinese people begins not in stillness or rooted certainty, but in movement, an epic of migration, struggle, and transformation. The origin of the Chinese people has long been a question wrapped in mystery, with many scholars and explorers trying to uncover the truth. Yet, even now, no one can say for certain who these people originally were or exactly where they came from. There are no clear answers, only pieces of evidence scattered through time, and these hints suggest that the Chinese were not native to the land they later made their home. The idea that they came from somewhere else seems more likely, and even within their own ancient traditions, there exists a belief that their ancestors came from the West. When we first see their story unfolding in the records of early history, we are not shown a group of people who have lived comfortably in the same place for countless generations. We see something quite different, a picture of determined strangers, unfamiliar with their surroundings, struggling against wild animals, cutting through thick forests, and slowly pushing away the native tribes who lived there before them. These early people were not at peace with the land. They were trying to tame it, to claim it as their own. Their arrival marked the beginning of a long and difficult transformation, where a foreign land would eventually become home, and where their story would grow into one of the longest and richest civilizations in the world. Among the many theories that tried to explain their beginning, one idea claimed that the Chinese were born from the very soil of the land they now live in, and that their culture and civilization grew there without outside influence. But over time, as more careful study was done and more discoveries were made, scholars began to see this idea as mistaken. Their focus turned instead to older lands far to the west, places where other great civilizations had flourished long before. One of these places was Acadia, an ancient region in Mesopotamia, which some researchers believe may have been the starting point of the long journey that would one day end in the valleys of China. Others believe that this journey passed through a second important region, Khotan in the Tarim Valley, or perhaps the nearby Kunlun Mountains. These locations, lying in what is now known as eastern Turkestan, may not have been the final origin, but rather important stops along the way. Some believe that the ancestors of the Chinese people stayed there for a time before continuing their movement east. This idea gained support from the fact that the civilization of Khotan appears to have been influenced by or even imported from the Punjab in the 3rd century BC, showing a connection between these regions. There have been mistakes in the past where early Chinese rulers were incorrectly matched with kings from Babylon, and where the name of the Chinese people, the Po-Sing or Bak-Sing, was confused with the Bak tribes. But these errors do not rule out the possibility that there really was a link between China and Acadia. What seems more certain is that no matter where the journey began, the movement of these people into what is now China was not sudden. It was likely slow, a gradual migration that took place over many years or even centuries. They may have come directly across the wide lands of Western or Central Asia to the banks of the Yellow River, or they may have taken a longer path, moving southeast through regions like Burma, and then curving northeast into China. If the latter is true, it means that the settlement of China happened in a direction opposite to what most people assume. Instead of moving from the north downward, the early settlers would have moved from the southwest toward the northeast, following rivers like the Yangtze as they made their way across the land. Still, this theory of a southern route presents many difficulties. It was likely suggested to support another idea, that the Chinese people actually came from the Indo-Chinese peninsula. This idea relies on 3 main points. First, that ancient Chinese writing includes symbols for tropical animals and plants. Second, that the oldest and most original forms of the Chinese language are found in the south. And third, that both Chinese and the languages spoken in Indochina are tonal in nature. But all of these facts, or supposed facts, can be explained just as well, or even better, by a different idea. Instead of saying the Chinese came from the south, it may be more accurate to say they arrived from the north or northwest in several waves. Each new wave of migrants would have pushed the earlier groups farther south, and this movement would explain why the oldest forms of the language are found there. They were carried by the people who arrived first and were later pushed toward the southern edges. The tonal languages of Indochina could also be seen as the result of these early migrations, with the people at the front of the movement spreading those patterns as they went. As for the writing symbols that refer to animals and plants, these do not necessarily point to tropical origins. In fact, many of the animals and plants shown in these early symbols belong to the temperate zone, not the tropics. And even if it could somehow be shown that these creatures now only live in the tropics, that still would not prove that the Chinese came from there. In ancient times, the climate in the north of China was very different. It was much milder than it is now, and forests covered large parts of the land. Wild animals like tigers and even elephants lived in those dense jungles, even though today such creatures are only found in the far south. So the presence of those animals in early symbols may simply reflect the natural world as it existed back then, not a clue about where the people themselves came from. Finally, there is one more strong reason to doubt the southern origin theory. If the Chinese people had truly come from the south, we would expect to see a slow movement from the southern or middle parts of China up toward the north. But the evidence does not support this. Everything we see suggests the opposite, that the direction of movement was from the north to the south. The spread of races and cultures appears to have followed that pattern, starting in the north and gradually expanding downward. This north to south expansion fits with the idea of waves of migrants arriving from the west or northwest and spreading across the land. Over time, these waves shape the landscape, the culture, and the people themselves. Though the full story remains hidden in the shadows of the past, what we do know points toward a long and difficult journey, filled with challenges, where each generation moved a little farther, fought a little harder, and built the foundations of a great civilization step by step until the land we now call China became their home. The flow of peoples and cultures in the regions surrounding ancient China moved in a clear direction from north to south, rather than the opposite, and this is supported by the traces left behind in language, migration, and historical movement. In the areas we now call Western Kansu and Sichuan, there once lived a group of people who, though not exactly the same as the earliest Chinese, were closely connected to them. This relationship has been shown through the study of language patterns, especially through Indo-Chinese comparative philology, which reveals shared roots and similarities that could not have formed by accident. These people eventually left those provinces and journeyed westward, moving into the high and rugged lands now known as Tibet, and over time became identified with the people we now call the Tibetans. They did not appear suddenly, nor did they come from an unrelated place, but emerged slowly, through movement and connection with surrounding groups. At the same time, farther to the south, in what we now call Yunnan, another people known as the Shan, or Ailao, lived and thrived. These people, who are now associated with the region we call Laos, were deeply affected by the arrival of the Mongols during their sweeping invasions. These invasions, filled with war and disorder, pushed the Shan out of their homeland. Seeking safety and a new place to live, they migrated further south into the peninsula, where they eventually became the people known today as the Siamese. The Mongol pressure was not just military, but social and environmental, displacing entire communities and changing the face of the region. Meanwhile, in Indochina, there were still more groups of people, though these were not related to the Chinese in any clear way. Among them were the Annamese, Khmer, Mon, Khasi, and Coleraines, along with many other tribes that are less well known today. These communities lived in a wide range of places and climates, and in very ancient times their presence even stretched into the southern parts of what is now China. But as the Chinese began to expand southward, they pushed these early peoples back, claiming the land for themselves, and slowly forcing them to retreat. This expansion was not peaceful. It was a slow, determined movement filled with resistance, and it led to major changes in the makeup of the region. Some of those displaced groups, like the Coleraines, left behind only scattered remnants, small surviving parts of their once larger societies, often found today only in the hill regions of central India, where they still cling to parts of their former identity. When looking at the whole picture and weighing all the available evidence, the theory that Chinese civilization came from immigrants arriving from the Tarim Valley or even farther west, possibly from places like Elam or Akkadiya, seems stronger than any other theory that has been offered. These immigrants may have come either directly or through eastern Turkestan, but whichever path they took, they eventually reached the banks of the Yellow River. Following the natural direction of the river, they journeyed along its course, moving steadily until they came to settle in the region where we first clearly find traces of their presence. This area, where the modern provinces of Shanxi, Shenxi, and Honan come together, became the heartland of early Chinese civilization. By the time they arrived and established themselves there, around 2500 or 3000 BC, they had already reached a relatively advanced stage in their development. They brought with them knowledge, structure, and the ability to organize themselves in ways that set them apart from the tribal and nomadic peoples they encountered. The land to the east and south of their new home was not empty. It was thick with forests and wildlife, and it was also inhabited by older native tribes who had lived there long before the newcomers arrived. The Chinese fought against the wild animals that roamed freely, battled the thick, tangled vegetation that resisted their farming tools and settlement efforts, and clashed with these aboriginal peoples. But not all contact was violent. Over time, the newcomers began to intermarry with the natives, blending bloodlines and traditions. They also planted colonies among them, settlements that served not only as homes, but also as centers from which their ideas, ways of living, and patterns of order could spread. These early Chinese settlers were not just warriors or pioneers, they were also builders, bringing with them a vision of civilization that slowly took root in the soil they had come to claim. When we turn our attention to the Kunlun Mountains, a place of great importance in Chinese mythology, we find another piece of the story. These mountains are said to be the home of the gods, the sacred place from which the ancestors of the Chinese people descended. But the mountains referred to by this name are not the ones that divide Tibet from Chinese Turkestan, as some might assume. Instead, they are more closely identified with the Hindu Kush, a range much farther to the west. This detail is important because it brings the story closer to the region of Babylon, where some of the earliest civilizations once lived. It also seems to connect the two major theories, the Central Asian and the Western Asian, by pointing to a shared middle ground that could hold the key to understanding the true beginning of the Chinese people. The myth of Nu Kua, said to be one of the creators of human beings in Chinese stories, and of Nu and Kua as the first man and woman in another version of the tale, places these figures in the Kunlun Mountains. At first, this might seem to support the idea that these mountains had a real historical role in the early life of the Chinese people. But sadly, this part of the story begins to fall apart under closer study. It has been shown that the legend of Kunlun is of Taoist origin and not rooted in older historical memory. The mountain is described in myth as being 3,000 miles high and standing at the very center of the world. From its summit flows the fountain of immortality, and from its sides pour the four great rivers that give life to the world. In other words, this is not a real place, but a mythological one. It is the same as Sumeru, the sacred mountain of Hindu mythology, copied and placed into Chinese legend. While this story is rich and meaningful within the religious and spiritual traditions of China, it does not help us in tracing the real history of how the Chinese people came to be. For our purpose of understanding their origin, it holds no historical value. There are many more details and paths that could be explored in this deep and fascinating problem of where the Chinese came from, how their civilization took shape, and what ties they might have shared with other ancient peoples. There are cultural similarities and connections to be studied and stories yet to be told, but for now, these questions must wait for another time, as even this part of the story has already taken us far along a long and winding path. Western Asia in pre-Babylonian times, the origin of the two distinct culture areas so marked throughout the greater part of Chinese history, and many other related questions offer a wide and complex field of study. But for now, without diving into all those intricate details, it is enough to settle on the conclusion that fits best with the evidence we currently have. And that conclusion, though still provisional and open to further discoveries, points clearly in one direction. It tells the story of a people who did not begin in the land we now call China, but came into it from the west. Their path may have begun in the ancient lands of Acadia or Elam, or perhaps they traveled through the region of Khotan as part of a long and difficult migration. The most likely path, according to the patterns of movement and cultural traces left behind, seems to have been from Acadia or Elam, passing through Khotan, before finally arriving at the edge of what is now northwestern China. These early people may not have come all at once. It's more likely they arrived in stages, as single tribes or as scattered groups of pastoral and nomadic people, or even as several large waves of migrants moving across the land over time. When they reached the edge of China proper, they began to settle in a place that became their first true home in this new land, the region around the Great Bend, or elbow of the Yellow River. From this foothold, they began to spread out, first toward the northeast, then eastward, and eventually southward, growing in number and power. As they moved, they encountered the earlier people who were already living in those regions, the Aboriginal tribes of China. These were not simply wiped away, but were instead gradually conquered, absorbed, or pushed further south and southwest. These native tribes themselves were not the first people to ever exist in the land either, but were likely the descendants of even earlier waves of Neolithic immigrants, who had also come from Western Asia at a much earlier time. Unlike the later, taller-headed groups that arrived in the 25th or 24th centuries BC, these Aboriginal people had arrived long before and had already left deep marks on the land and its future. Their influence can be clearly seen in the Japanese, showing how far their cultural and genetic legacy extended. When the later arrivals came from the northwest and met the Aboriginals in the south, they did not stay separate. They mixed, they married, and their children carried the traits of both worlds. This union, formed through centuries of contact, shaped the strong differences we now see between the people of northern and southern China. These differences are not just physical, though they are often described in terms of body type and appearance. They also show up in how people think, feel, speak, and create. There are clear differences in sentiment, in emotion, in ideas, in the ways people work, in the tools and crafts they use, and in the languages and dialects that took shape. At the beginning of what we call the known history of China, the space that these early Chinese occupied was not large. It was a small and irregularly shaped region, sitting between the lines of latitude 34 degrees and 40 degrees north, and between longitude 107 degrees and 114 degrees east. This small land, wrapped around the elbow of the Yellow River, covered only about 50,000 square miles. Yet, from this small beginning, something enormous would grow. As the people living there developed their skills, their social systems, and their ability to expand and survive, they slowly pushed outward. The first major move was to stretch northeastward toward the coast, reaching as far as longitude 119 degrees. With this step, the land they occupied doubled in size. At first, the population of this early China was probably around 1 million people. As the land grew, so too did the number of its people, rising to around 2 million, as new space allowed for more settlements. This early stage of Chinese life, sometimes called infant China, took place during the long period known as the feudal period, which lasted for roughly 2,000 years between the 24th century BC and the 3rd century BC. After that, a new phase began. The monarchical period opened in 221 BC and would last all the way until the early 20th century AD. During the first centuries of this period, the Chinese expanded their territory southward at a great pace. The area they controlled grew to cover nearly all of what we now think of as China proper, the 18 provinces, with only a few areas still beyond their full reach. These were parts of the west of Kansu and most of the provinces of Sichuan and Yunnan, which remained less tightly held. But even those would one day be drawn in. By the time of the Manchu conquest in the early 17th century AD, the Chinese domain had grown to massive proportions. It stretched across lands between latitude 18 degrees and 40 degrees north, and longitude 98 degrees and 122 degrees east. This covered the 18 provinces completely and added a series of great outer territories: Manchuria in the northeast, Mongolia in the north, Ilai to the west, Kokonor and Tibet in the highlands, and Korea to the east. At different times, their influence extended into Burma and Annam as well. Altogether, the full area under their rule or suzerainty reached more than 5 million square miles. Of that vast total, the 18 provinces alone made up about 2 million square miles. The nature of the land itself helped shape the way people lived and moved. Most of this wide territory is mountainous in the west, where high peaks and rough terrain made movement difficult and kept communities somewhat isolated. From there, the land slopes gently down as one moves eastward toward the sea. This steady incline allowed rivers to form, agriculture to flourish, and people to build large cities. These geographical features were not just background. They helped decide where people could live, farm, travel, and grow. The history of China's growth was not only a story of migrations and battles, but also a story of how the land allowed some things and resisted others. The physical world, the mountains, rivers, and valleys, had a powerful role in deciding where people settled and how far they could go. And so the story of the Chinese people, their rise from a small group on the bend of a river to rulers of a vast empire, is also the story of their relationship with the land beneath their feet. Through war and peace, movement and marriage, they built a culture rooted in deep time and wide space, shaped as much by the ground and sky as by the people themselves. This immense land, stretching from the rugged mountains in the west down to the wide shores in the east, unfolds like a massive canvas painted with the layers of time, each one revealing something different. It contains 3 great mountain ranges, each standing like a barrier shaped by the earth's slow hands, and surrounding these highlands are large, fertile plains that spread across the north, east, and south, catching the silt and water that the rivers have carried over thousands of years. These plains, being alluvial, are rich in soil and life, and they rest on even older beds of granite, red sandstone, and limestone, forming a foundation as ancient as the people who once crossed the land in search of a place to settle. In the north, the land wears a special coat called loess, a light and dusty soil formed from the fine particles of dust that were blown for countless ages from the Mongolian plateau. This unique formation gives the ground its soft, powdery texture and carries with it the memory of winds that swept across distant deserts. As one moves from the north down to the south, the rocks grow younger in age, showing the geological story from old to new. And a similar pattern is seen when traveling from east to west. In the far west and the south, one may even find signs of ancient volcanic activity, silent reminders of when the earth shook with fire and molten rock. Beneath the ground, the land is rich with treasures, coal and iron in great amounts, and also gold, silver, copper, lead, tin, jade, and many other valuable materials that have long shaped the tools, ornaments, and wealth of those who lived upon it. The climate, like the land, is not the same everywhere. In the north, the winters stretch long and cold, with frost gripping the soil for many months, and summers arrive with heat and dryness, broken only by a short rainy season during July and August. In the south, the pattern is different. The summer lasts much longer, and it brings with it not just heat, but heavy moisture that clings to everything. Winters there are shorter, barely touching the land before the warm months return. On average, the temperature hovers around 50 degrees Fahrenheit in the north and about 70 degrees in the south, although these numbers can vary. Compared to the same latitudes in Europe, the thermometer seems low, but that is mostly because Europe's west coast is warmed by the Gulf Stream, while this land lies under different skies. Rainfall follows a similar contrast, about 16 inches yearly in the north and as much as 70 inches in the south, with many parts in between seeing different amounts. From July to October, powerful typhoons can crash into the southern coast, bringing fierce winds and rain, sometimes reshaping the shores and the lives of those who live near them. Life here, however, is not only defined by the land and the skies, but also by what grows and breathes within it. The plants are many and varied, with green spreading far and wide in every direction. The southern half of the country falls within the rice zone, an area where this essential grain grows best, and this fact has shaped not only farming, but also the way people think, eat, and live. In these southern and central regions, tea plants flourish as well. Although tea began as a simple leaf by the year 350 AD, it had already become prized for its infusion, and it spread across the land as both crop and culture. It grows best between the latitudes of 23 and 35 degrees, though it can also be found as far north as Shantung.
Still, the heart of tea country lies in the broad region south of the Yangtze River, east of the Great Tungting Lake and the mighty Xiang River, and north of Guangdong Province. Other crops fill the land, including wheat, barley, maize, millet, various beans, yams, sweet and common potatoes, and many types of vegetables, like the tomato, eggplant, and cabbage. Ginseng grows in shaded places, and bamboo shoots rise tall and green. Indigo, pepper, tobacco, camphor, tallow, groundnuts, poppies, watermelons, sugarcane, cotton, hemp, and silk also grow and are used in many parts of life, from food to clothes to trade. In the orchards and groves, one finds fruits both familiar and strange: dates, mulberries, oranges, lemons, pomelos, persimmons, lychees, pomegranates, pineapples, figs, coconuts, mangoes, and bananas, along with many others that fill the markets and homes with their colors and scents. The wild animals of the land are many and fierce. Tigers and panthers move silently through the forests, while leopards hide in the high grass. Bears wander the mountains, and sables and otters slip through the rivers and snow. Monkeys swing through the trees, and wolves and foxes watch from the shadows. The hills and plains are filled with more than 27 different species of ruminants, all grazing and moving in herds. Rodents of every kind scurry underfoot, and in the province of Yunnan, one can still find great beasts like the rhinoceros, elephant, and tapir roaming in quiet corners of the land. Among the animals raised by humans, camels march through deserts carrying burdens, while the water buffalo wade in the fields, pulling plows and helping farmers in their daily work. Birds fill the skies in countless numbers, more than 700 species, each with its own cry and flight. In the rivers and lakes, in the ponds and streams, there are fish beyond counting, and in every patch of ground, insects hum and buzz, filling the world with life both seen and unseen. But nature alone did not shape this land. People did too. When the Chinese first arrived in the land that would become their home, they met resistance. The Aboriginal tribes who already lived there did not step aside quietly. The early Chinese had to fight for the land, battling not only the forests and beasts, but also these native people. Some of these tribes were wiped out. Others were absorbed into the growing Chinese population through marriage and culture, and others still were forced to move southward, pushed away by the expanding influence of the newcomers. As Chinese rule spread over the land, it brought with it new ways of living, new tools, new crops, new languages, and new beliefs. And as they moved across the land, the Chinese began to shape not just the world around them, but also themselves, becoming something different with each step forward, different from who they had been before, and different in every region they settled. Through all this movement and change, they became the people of the rivers and mountains, the fields and forests, the markets and cities, a people shaped as much by their struggles as by their land. They had settled the best parts of the land, selecting what they called the eyes of the earth, the fertile plains, the wide river valleys, and the regions rich in resources, leaving the harder, less hospitable places to others. The non-Chinese tribes, who had once shared the land or contested its control, were slowly pushed into areas where living was more difficult. These people now found themselves in the humid forests or marshes of the deep south, or high up in mountain regions that were hard to reach, where farming was difficult and travel even more so. Some of them, by their own choice rather than any forced removal, took to living in trees, building their homes high above the forest floor. A few groups, like the Dog Yung in the southeastern region, managed to retain their presence in areas now dominated by the ruling race, maintaining small pockets of settlement like scattered islands surrounded by the growing sea of Chinese culture and control. But new challenges began to rise from other directions. In the 3rd century BC, the Chinese came into open conflict with the northern nomadic tribes, whose movements and raids would become a constant thread in the long weave of Chinese history. These tense and hostile encounters with the northern horsemen did not end quickly, but continued for many centuries, shaping the borderlands and forcing the Chinese to fortify their defenses and build long walls across the northern frontiers. Meanwhile, beyond the immediate neighbors, a wider world began to reach into China's domain. Between the 1st and 6th centuries AD, the Chinese were not isolated. There was contact and trade with distant places: Rome in the far west, Parthia with its ancient cities, the Turks who moved across central plains, and the lands of Mesopotamia. The seas carried travelers and goods to and from Ceylon and India, while closer neighbors like Indochina added to the cultural and commercial mix. In the 7th century, the Arabs arrived as part of this growing network, bringing their own traditions and ideas. Over time, the sociological environment widened even further, with Europe gradually drawn into China's sphere. Christian travelers made their way eastward, sometimes as missionaries, sometimes as observers, sometimes simply as curious strangers looking for wonders. Between the 10th and 13th centuries, the power dynamics shifted again. The north was no longer solely in Chinese hands, as the Khitans and the Nukians came to occupy large portions of it. Then, in the 13th and 14th centuries, the entire empire was overtaken by the Mongols, whose control lasted 88 years and left deep marks on the institutions, administration, and structure of the state. Even after the Mongols, China maintained relationships with surrounding peoples. Over the next 400 years, contact with neighboring countries continued, often through trade or religious exchange. These relations did not always involve conflict. Many were peaceful, commercial, and cultural. But with the arrival of Western powers, the story began to take another turn. In the 18th and 19th centuries, wars were fought between China and the foreign nations that now approached with ships, guns, and treaties. These conflicts forced open new types of diplomacy. For the first time, formal and regular diplomatic relations were established with Western powers. Yet the Chinese people and rulers often remained hesitant. They preferred to hold themselves apart from outside alliances and maintained a strong dislike for the interference of foreign nations. But that distance became harder to maintain. From the year 1537 onward, through the outcomes of wars and the signing of various treaties, foreign powers gradually obtained concessions, sections of land, settlements, and trading rights within Chinese territory. As time went on, China began to lose control of some of her border regions and large nearby islands. What had once been military pressure from nomadic tribes in the north and west was now replaced by military and economic pressure from the modern powers of the West and from Japan. These newer threats came not only with armies, but with factories, banks, and political influence. The challenges were different, but the danger remained. For a country built on farming and rooted in agricultural traditions, the new world of machines and empires posed a deep problem. The question became how to hold the nation together, how to develop the strength and the military spirit needed to protect its territory and traditions. The continued loss of its land and culture to any student of social history would seem not only a tragedy for one country, but a blow felt across the whole world. A calamity that would mark a great turning point. As for the people themselves, the physical features of the Chinese were and are well known. The first settlers in the northern regions were originally from blonde racial groups, tall and light in color. But over time, the physical traits changed. The modern population no longer showed much of the earlier features. Now the people had black hair, coarse, thick, and straight, shaped like a cylinder under the microscope. Beards were rare or thin. The eyes were almond-shaped and set at a slant, with the black irises often partly hidden by a vertical fold of skin that covered the inner corner of the eye, a unique trait among the eastern peoples of Asia. The bones of the face were flat, and the distance between the eye sockets was wide. Most people were shorter than the world average, and the average weight of the brain was also on the lower side, though this did not necessarily reflect their intellectual abilities. Skin color was generally lighter in the north and darker in the south, following the pattern of sunlight and climate. In matters of the heart and mind, the Chinese people showed strong contrasts. Emotionally, they were known to be calm and steady. They worked hard, showed great patience, and had a deep ability to endure. They valued respect and good manners, showing gratitude and treating guests and elders with formal courtesy. In business, they were known for their honesty, keeping promises, and maintaining trust. But, like all people, they had shadows as well. They could be fearful, at times cruel, lacking in sympathy, and slow to express warmth. Lies and exaggerations were not uncommon, and desire could sometimes lead to shameful behavior. Mentally, they had been for a long time stuck in tradition. They followed old ways closely, often resisting new ideas or changes. They preferred order, uniformity, and routine. Creativity was not encouraged, and imagination was not highly valued. They were more likely to copy than to invent, more likely to remain still than to take bold steps. Their thinking was often slow and cautious, sometimes twisted by suspicion and superstition. Yet, as contact with other nations grew, so too did the influence of new thoughts, new tools, and new systems. Slowly but surely, the long-held traits of mind and spirit began to shift, pressed and pulled by the strong forces of global interaction. And so the character of a people who had once held themselves apart from the world began to change, not erased, not replaced, but reshaped by all they had endured and all they had encountered. The system of marriage, rooted in the earliest traditions of China, reflected the social values and structures that shaped daily life. Even in the parts of the marriage ceremony that are still observed today, one can see hints that the original form of marriage might have been by capture. This idea is not without support, as classical texts such as the Book of Odes seem to confirm the practice, showing that taking a bride by force may have once been acceptable or even expected. Yet, despite this earlier form, a more formal kind of marriage had already come into existence in historical times. This later form, though more organized, was still essentially a transaction, a sale contract more than a romantic union. Monogamy was not the standard at the beginning. Instead, what slowly developed was a type of monogamy that included a main wife and one or more concubines. There was a wife who held the formal and social position in the household, but the number of concubines that could be kept depended largely on how wealthy the man was. The richer the man, the more concubines and handmaids he could afford. Among the nobility, the number could be in the hundreds, especially in royal households, where kings and princes kept vast numbers of women in their palaces. Over time, this structure remained largely unchanged. Even today, although laws and social attitudes have begun to shift and organizations now work to end concubinage, the historical roots of this practice remain visible in many customs and social attitudes. Throughout all of Chinese history, concubinage was widespread and accepted. There are even rare traces suggesting that polyandry, where a woman has more than one husband, may have occurred in some isolated cases, though it was never widely practiced. When it came to the timing of marriage, there were clear rules. Men were expected to marry by the age of 20 and girls by 15. If a man remained unmarried past 30 or a woman past 20, it was viewed negatively and even officially discouraged. In one region, the province of Shantung, there was a local custom where it was common for wives to be older than their husbands, a small difference from the norm. But the essence of marriage was firmly rooted in family decisions. The process usually began when the parents of a young man decided it was time for him to marry. They would reach out through a matchmaker to the family of a suitable girl. The proposal was discussed and agreed upon by the parents on both sides. The feelings or wishes of the young couple were not considered important. Once the arrangement was made and the match confirmed, the bride would eventually be taken from her family home to the home of the bridegroom. There, after a set of ceremonial steps, both she and her husband would stand before his ancestral shrine. Together, they performed a ritual to announce their union to the ancestors, informing the spirits of the family that a new member had joined their line. The ceremony was more symbolic than deeply spiritual, but it carried the full weight of tradition. After staying with her new husband for a brief period, the bride would return to her parents for a visit. Only after this return and second departure was the marriage seen as final. This reflected the deep importance of family ties and the need to maintain harmony between the two households. But for the woman, life in her new home was often difficult. The position of women was low in society, and the power of the husband over her was extreme. So strong was the authority given to husbands that they could, without punishment, even kill their wives. Divorce laws, too, heavily favored men. A woman could not legally divorce her husband, but the man could send her away for many reasons, including disobedience or simply for being too talkative. If a man lost his wife, he was expected to remarry quickly. There was no shame in this, and it was seen as a practical step. But a widow was held to a much stricter standard. While not forced to remain alone, she was praised if she chose not to marry again. In fact, not remarrying became a sign of great virtue and loyalty. Some widows even went to extreme lengths to prove their dedication to their late husbands. It was not uncommon for a widow to harm herself or take her own life to ensure that she would never be remarried. These acts of self-sacrifice were honored after death, celebrated as signs of pure devotion. The reason behind this belief was simple, yet harsh. A woman was seen as belonging fully to her husband, not just in this life, but in the afterlife as well. Remarriage would be seen as a betrayal, a form of disobedience. For the man, this logic did not apply. If he remarried, it was not considered disloyal. He was just expanding his family. No one's rights were violated, and the addition of a new wife or concubine was viewed as a natural act. As the centuries passed, this structure of marriage remained largely unchanged. Through long periods of history, including the eras when monarchies ruled and even into the time of the Republic, the essential form of marriage stayed the same. The customs, the power balance between men and women, and the rules about matchmaking and rituals did not shift much, even as other aspects of society began to transform. In many ways, marriage continued to reflect the core values and social hierarchies of the wider culture, holding on tightly to the past even as the world around it slowly moved forward. The weight of tradition, the strength of ancestral belief, and the rigid structures of hierarchy kept the system in place, generation after generation, making it one of the most enduring features of early and classical Chinese life. Region, it was discouraged by moral appeals rather than strict laws, with local officials urging people through proclamations and temple notices to value human life and protect infants, especially girls. Yet even as these appeals were made, the strength of custom, economic hardship, and social pressure often overpowered any moral persuasion. Girls, seen as less valuable because they would eventually marry out and join another family, were the most common victims. Many newborn daughters were quietly discarded, drowned in basins, or simply left to die, a practice so normalized in some villages that it barely stirred comment. Boys, on the other hand, were treasured as they carried on the family name and performed the vital rites to honor the ancestors. The role of the father was all-powerful. His authority over his children was absolute. Obedience was not just expected, it was required. A child had no standing apart from his father, and even in adulthood, a son's place remained under the will of his parents. A son who defied his father could be disowned or punished, and even the law would rarely intervene on the son's behalf. Education, marriage, and even career choices were all decided by the father. If the father was dead, the responsibility passed to the elder male relatives, ensuring that the line of control never broke. In this structure, love was not often openly expressed, and affection between parents and children took a backseat to duty, respect, and strict discipline. A parent could beat a child severely for disobedience, and society would see it as correction, not cruelty. Respect for elders was the foundation of family life, and this respect was reinforced from a very early age. Children learned to bow, to speak softly, to never contradict, and to always act with deference. Even adult sons would kneel before aging parents, listening without interruption, obeying without hesitation. This rigid family structure was considered essential to maintaining harmony in society. Just as the emperor ruled the empire, the father ruled the home, and both were seen as central to the balance of the world. The family was not just a social unit, but a sacred one, tied together not by emotional bonds alone, but by obligations that stretched into the afterlife. Ancestor worship was not optional. It was a duty, and sons had to continue the family rituals without fail. A family without sons was viewed as a tragedy, not just for the parents, but for generations past. That is why marriage, and especially the birth of sons, carried so much weight. And so, the entire structure, from arranged marriages to the heavy preference for sons, was built to preserve the line and ensure the spirits of the dead were never neglected. This deep-rooted belief system made reform very difficult. Even when laws were introduced to protect women or limit abuse, change was slow. The traditions were so old, so respected, that even those who suffered under them often saw them as natural, even righteous. It took more than new governments and foreign influence to shake the core of Chinese family life. With the fall of the monarchy and the rise of the republic in 1912, changes slowly began to appear. The younger generation, influenced by new ideas, began to question the old ways. Schools were established that admitted girls, and education for women slowly gained ground. Still, marriage customs clung to the past. The idea of matchmaking, parental control, and the silence of the bride continued, even as young people in cities flirted with the idea of choosing their own partners. The traditional marriage remained deeply woven into daily life, but change did come, especially in the cities. Women, once kept indoors, began to appear in public life. Some got jobs, others took part in social events, and a few even entered politics or business. Clothes changed, too, with modern styles replacing the old garments. Sports, once unthinkable for women, became popular. And in this new world, many educated men began to feel ashamed of their traditional wives, women who had small bound feet, who could not read, and who had never been allowed to develop their minds or personalities. In some cases, these men, eager to fit into a more modern, Western-influenced society, left their old wives and married younger, more fashionable women. These new wives, often educated and confident, were seen as better companions in the public life that these men now embraced. Though the number of such cases was not massive, it was a clear sign that the old ways were under pressure. Yet, even in this shift, contradictions remained. The new marriages still followed many old customs. The ceremonies were often a strange mix, half Western, half Chinese. In some weddings, a bride might ride in a Western-style carriage, while the rest of the procession followed traditional music and costume. A groom might wear a Western hat with a Chinese robe. The blend reflected the tension of a society caught between two worlds, holding on to the past while peering into a different future. Despite all these changes, the basic marriage contract remained largely the same. It was still a family decision, still rooted in hierarchy, still deeply tied to duty rather than affection. And in many rural areas, little changed at all. There, girls still married young, still followed their husbands without question, and still carried the full burden of housework and childbearing. Divorce remained rare and heavily frowned upon. Widows who refused to remarry were still honored, though fewer committed suicide to prove their loyalty. Yet the cracks in the old system widened with every decade. Schools, cities, foreign books, and modern jobs all pulled people away from the ancient patterns. And while the core beliefs lingered, the world around them kept shifting. The family remained central, but its shape began to change. Fathers began to lose some of their power. Sons and daughters started to think for themselves. And though the road ahead was unclear, the era of silent wives and unquestioned fathers was slowly giving way to something different, something still deeply Chinese, but also something new. Local authorities took the practice of infanticide seriously enough to issue official proclamations condemning it, trying to curb this harsh custom that was rooted in poverty and social preference for male children. These announcements, though not always effective, reflected attempts to influence public opinion and discourage the practice, showing the tension between age-old customs and evolving moral views. Adoption by purchase and contract was also common, where a man could legally adopt someone as his son, daughter, or grandchild, granting that person all the legal rights and duties of a biological child. This system allowed families without heirs to continue their lineage and maintain their property within the family name. When it came to inheritance, the laws were quite detailed. Both real and personal property were shared jointly among all sons, whether born of wives or concubines, without consideration of their birth order, emphasizing collective family ownership over individual possession. Even children born outside formal marriage, often called bastards, were entitled to inherit half as much as legitimate sons. Estates were treated as undivided during the lifetime of the parents or grandparents, ensuring that family wealth remained intact rather than being fragmented among descendants. The head of the family did not own the property outright, but was rather a life renter, managing it according to strict family rules. Wills were mostly unnecessary since the family head's role and the customs regulated property succession clearly, but when needed, parents could give verbal or written instructions to arrange the details of inheritance, reflecting a degree of flexibility within tradition. In the absence of a father, the male relatives sharing the family surname would step in as guardians for the children, wielding full authority over their upbringing and estate management. These guardians could enjoy the surplus income from the ward's property, but were not allowed to sell or alienate the assets, protecting the family's long-term interests. Throughout Chinese history, stories of children showing extreme devotion to their parents abound, some going so far as to injure or even kill themselves in hopes of healing or saving their parents, illustrating the intense familial loyalty embedded in the culture and the power of filial piety as a guiding moral principle. When the ancestors of the Chinese people first arrived from the West, they settled in a region where the modern provinces of Shanxi, Shenxi, and Honan meet. Over time, they expanded eastward to reach the shores of the Gulf of Chile, an area roughly 600 miles long and 300 miles wide, which initially housed a population estimated between 1 and 2 million. For nearly 2,000 years, this core region remained relatively stable in size, though the Chinese established colonies known as Chou beyond its southern borders. These colonies served as footholds, growing through the conquest and assimilation of neighboring lands and peoples, gradually extending Chinese influence over a broader territory. In 221 BC, a crucial turning point arrived, when the many feudal states dividing this territory were conquered and unified under the state of Qin. This marked the beginning of monarchical government in China, a system that would endure for more than 2 millennia. The name China itself is believed by many scholars to have originated from the name of this powerful Qin state, linking the nation's identity directly to this historic moment of unification. The short-lived Qin dynasty was followed by the long-lasting and influential Han dynasty, which ruled from 221 BC to AD 221. During this era, the empire's borders stretched to include nearly all of what is now recognized as China proper, the core 18 provinces of later Manchu times. The empire's reach continued to expand, adding territories such as Korea, Xinjiang, also known as Eastern Turkestan, Manchuria, Formosa, now Taiwan, Tibet, and Mongolia between 194 BC and AD 1414. However, some of these territories were lost in more recent history. For instance, Formosa and Korea were annexed by Japan in 1895 and 1910, respectively, showing that the empire's boundaries fluctuated significantly over time due to political and military pressures. Beyond the mainland, the Chinese Empire also had influence over many other neighboring countries and islands throughout its history. At one point, from 73 to 48 BC, Chinese control extended over all Asia east of the Ganges, demonstrating a period of exceptional expansion and dominance in the region. This extensive political history reflects centuries of military conquest, political unification, and cultural assimilation, shaping the vast and diverse territory that eventually became modern China. The story of these early settlements, dynastic rises, and territorial expansions illustrates not only the growth of a nation, but also the complexities of managing such a large, diverse population over millennia. The blending of various peoples, the rise and fall of dynasties, and the shifting borders all tell a tale of resilience, adaptation, and the relentless pursuit of unity and identity. Through this long history, the Chinese Empire developed a unique social and political structure, deeply connected to family, tradition, and the land. The strong bonds of kinship and loyalty, combined with the evolving power of the monarchy, created a foundation for one of the oldest continuous civilizations in the world. This foundation was tested by internal conflicts, external invasions, and changes in the world beyond China's borders, but it endured, adapting to new realities while preserving core elements of its culture and society. From small beginnings at the elbow of the Yellow River to a sprawling empire touching diverse peoples and landscapes, the history of early China is a story of gradual growth, strategic expansion, and enduring legacy that continues to influence the world today. Over many centuries, the extent of China's influence expanded dramatically, once stretching from Japan in the east all the way to the Caspian Sea in the west, a vast region brought into tributary relation with the Middle Kingdom, or China as it was known. This immense reach need not be detailed here, but it is a testament to the historical power and scope of the empire. In the southern Sung dynasty from 1127 to 1280, the Tartars controlled the northern half of China, reaching as far south as the Yangtze River. Later, during the Yuan dynasty from 1280 to 1368, they conquered the entire country, bringing all of China under their rule. Following this period, from 1644 to 1912, the Manchus took control and maintained possession of the land. In modern times, this complex history is symbolized in the national flag adopted with the founding of the Republic in 1912. This flag, with 5 stripes representing the main ethnic groups of China, is a visual reflection of the nation's diversity. The red stripe for the Manchus, yellow for the Han Chinese, blue for the Mongolians, white for the Mohammedans, and black for the Tibetans. This new flag replaced the older triangular dragon flag, marking a new era in China's identity. By this time, the population, which had fluctuated over centuries due to wars, famines, and diseases, had grown to approximately 400 million people, making it one of the most populous nations on Earth. The general government structure of China was organized around the relationship between the king and the people, a system built on the belief that the king was appointed by the will of heaven and was the father of the people. The king was not just a ruler. He was also the lawgiver, the supreme military commander, the chief priest, and the master of ceremonies, encompassing all aspects of governance and spiritual leadership. The people themselves were divided into 4 main classes. The first class was the Shi, or officers, who later came to be known as scholars. This group included officials, some of whom were ennobled, and the gentry class who held social and political power. The second class was the Nung, or agriculturists, who formed the backbone of society by working the land and providing food. The third class was the Kung, or artisans, skilled workers who crafted goods and tools necessary for daily life. Lastly, the Shang, or merchants, engaged in trade and commerce, facilitating economic exchange within and beyond China's borders. This clear social structure allowed for an ordered society where everyone had a defined role, contributing to the nation's stability and continuity. For administrative efficiency, the government was divided into a central hierarchy, headed by ministers and supported by a network of officials. The seat of central government moved several times during the feudal period, beginning at Pyongyang in modern Shanxi and eventually settling at Yin. The country was divided into provinces, with the number varying over time, from 9 provinces in early history to 36 under the first emperor in 221 BC, and finally settling at 22 provinces in more recent times. Within these provinces were smaller administrative units called states, which served as models of the central state, reinforcing the idea of the ruler's middle kingdom as the center of order. Provincial administration was handled by 12 pastors or lord lieutenants who acted as chiefs over all the nobles in their province. Interestingly, civil and military roles were not separated, meaning these leaders held both administrative and military authority. Feudal lords or princes often lived at the king's court and could be appointed as rulers of these states, creating a tight connection between the central government and regional authorities. The king held the power to create laws and administer justice, while the princes had authority over rewards and punishments within their domains. The state's revenue came from multiple sources: a tithe on land, incomes from artisans, merchants, fishermen, and foresters, as well as tribute paid by various savage tribes on the empire's borders. This system of administration and taxation was remarkably consistent over time, changing little from the early feudal periods through the long monarchical era that ended in 1912. By the end of this period, the emperor was still regarded as having divine descent and held supreme authority over civil, legislative, military, religious, and ceremonial functions. The 4 social classes persisted, maintaining the social order that had shaped Chinese society for centuries. The chief ministry, located at the capital, Peking, could trace their origins back to their feudal prototypes, reflecting a strong continuity of governmental structure. This enduring political and social framework illustrates how China managed to maintain a stable and hierarchical system through immense historical changes, invasions, and cultural shifts. The intertwined relationship of ruler and ruled, the clear division of social classes, and the strong provincial administration all worked to preserve unity and order across a vast and diverse land. The legacy of this system continues to influence China's modern political and social landscape, reminding us of the deep roots that bind the past and present of this ancient civilization. The principal provincial officials in China, such as the governor-general or viceroy, governors, provincial treasurers, and judges, held positions that traced their origins far back in history, maintaining a remarkable continuity with offices that existed many centuries earlier, a tradition likely unique in the world. At first, appointments to office were made by selection and tested by examinations to prove proficiency. But later, a more formal system emerged, centered on public competitive literary examinations. These exams became fully organized in the 17th century and remained the primary method for selecting officials until 1903. At that time, the examination system was abolished, and instead official positions were open to graduates of modern colleges established with Western-style curricula. This marked a major shift from tradition toward modernization. Then, in 1912, after the overthrow of the Manchu monarchy, China became a republic with an elected president and a parliament consisting of a Senate and a House of Representatives. The government departments were reorganized following Western models, creating many new offices and bureaucratic positions to reflect this change. However, the country remained politically divided, especially between the northern and southern regions, and this division prevented the full implementation of the Constitution's laws even up to the present day. Turning to the laws of China, one finds that, like many primitive legal systems, Chinese law was not primarily designed to ensure fairness or justice between individuals, but rather to maintain the strict subordination of the ruled to the ruler. The laws were mostly punitive and harsh, focusing on punishment rather than rehabilitation or making amends. They were criminal in nature, aiming to deter disobedience through fear. Punishments were often cruel and severe, including branding, cutting off the nose, amputating legs at the knees, castration, and death. Death sentences were not limited to murder, but could be imposed for many other offenses. Punishment could also extend beyond the individual, affecting the family, clan, and even neighbors of the offender, illustrating the collective responsibility mindset deeply rooted in Chinese society. The principle of lex talionis, or an eye for an eye, was strictly applied. Despite this harshness, the Chinese developed a series of legal codes that were well organized and detailed. The earliest known was a revision of King Mu's punishments around 950 BC, and the first official code appeared in 650 BC. This long tradition culminated in the Ta Ching Lu Li, or Laws and Statutes of the Great Qing Dynasty, issued in 1647, which remained in force until recent times. Among these codes, the most famous was the Law Classic, drafted by the statesman Li Kuei during the 4th century BC while serving the first ruler of the Wei state. This code laid out detailed rules and principles that guided the empire's legal thinking. The Ta Ching Lu Li, praised by many judges for its comprehensiveness, originally sanctioned only 2 punishments: death and flogging. However, over the centuries, other forms of punishment became common, including the infamous ling chui, a form of lingering death or slicing a person to pieces, invented around AD 1000. This brutal punishment was reserved for the most serious crimes, such as high treason, parricide, murder of 3 family members, and in some cases, women who killed their husbands. Ling Chi was officially abolished in 1905, yet cruel punishments continued in practice even after that. Until China gained first-hand knowledge of Western legal systems and procedures, the traditional idea of punishment remained focused on vindictiveness rather than reformation or rehabilitation, a mentality that persisted well into modern times and has not completely disappeared. Even though some of the cruelest punishments were formally outlawed, they still were used in many regions. This tension between old and new reflects the struggle in Chinese society to balance respect for tradition with the pressures of modernization and reform. Punishment was also deeply tied to family and community responsibilities, and even after harsh penalties, there remained a belief in the importance of upholding family honor and social order. The laws reinforced the hierarchical structure of society and ensured that the authority of the ruler and state was respected above all else. This made the Chinese legal system one deeply intertwined with social and political control rather than the protection of individual rights. In terms of administrative continuity, the provincial officials who governed large areas carried on long-standing traditions, exercising powers that linked them closely to the central government while managing local affairs. This continuity in administration helped maintain stability through centuries of change, allowing the government to function effectively even as dynasties rose and fell. Officials were often chosen from the ranks of scholars who passed difficult examinations based on Confucian classics, which ensured that those in power had a grounding in the dominant philosophy of social order and morality. This system created a bureaucracy that was both meritocratic and deeply rooted in cultural values. The replacement of the old examination system by modern educational institutions marked a major shift in Chinese governance, symbolizing a move towards greater openness and adaptability. Yet, the deep respect for hierarchical order and the centralized authority of the state remained a defining feature of Chinese political life. The shift to a republic in 1912 introduced new political ideas and structures, but the deep-rooted social classes, the respect for imperial authority, and the traditional modes of governance did not disappear overnight. The legacy of monarchy and imperial administration influenced even the Republican government, and many aspects of the old system continued to shape politics and society. The law and administration in China, as in many ancient civilizations, were tools not just for governing, but for preserving a worldview that placed the ruler at the center of the universe and society. Punishment was harsh and designed to uphold this order, and officials served as agents of this system, selected through examinations rooted in centuries-old traditions. The changes in the early 20th century brought new challenges and shifts, but they were built upon a long history that had shaped China into the complex and layered society that it is today. This deep history of governance and law, blending continuity and change, reflects the enduring character of the Chinese state and its people. At the end of the long monarchical era in China, the legal system still retained many harsh and outdated practices that had persisted for thousands of years. Even as late as that period, it was common in court trials for prisoners to be subjected to brutal torture methods, such as being hung by their thumbs or forced to kneel on chains, all aimed at forcing them to confess to crimes. Without a confession, no accused person could be punished, so the torture was used as a grim tool to extract admissions of guilt, regardless of the truth. This revealed that the true purpose of punishment, its proper end, which ideally should be to stop the cycle of crime by reforming the offender or securing justice, was still far from being understood or accepted in Chinese society. Instead, punishment remained primarily an instrument of cruelty and control. Toward the end of the Manchu dynasty, when China faced strong pressure from Western powers threatening its sovereignty, a reform movement was forced upon the country. These foreign powers promised to end the system of extraterritoriality, under which foreigners in China were subject to their own laws rather than Chinese law, if China reformed its judicial system. As part of this reform, a new provisional criminal code was introduced, which replaced the harsh practices of decapitation and bambooing, a form of beating with bamboo sticks, with death by hanging or strangulation and imprisonment for varying terms. This code was largely adopted by the new Republican government established after the fall of the monarchy and remains the main legal framework used today. However, a closer look shows that this new code was almost a direct copy of the Japanese Penal Code, which itself had been modeled on the German legal system. In other words, the Chinese Code was a Western-style legal system imposed on China by imitation, and as it currently stands, it does not fit well with the actual social and cultural conditions in China. The Code requires further changes and adaptation to become truly just, effective, and practical for the Chinese people. Moreover, even with these reforms, the law was frequently ignored or abused by local authorities, particularly the police, who sometimes kept people in custody despite court acquittals until they could extort money or favors from them. Although the draft of the new criminal code included provisions for trial by jury, a key element of Western legal systems, this idea never came into practice in China. Ironically, the official reason for rejecting jury trials was that since Japan, whose legal system China was copying, had abolished jury trials, it would be unwise for China to adopt this Western institution. This example shows the often contradictory and blind imitation of foreign systems without careful adaptation to Chinese realities. When it comes to local government, China's vast and complex official system left very little space for independent local authority. Governance was highly centralized, with a wide network of officials managing affairs from the top down. Local government existed only in small measure, mostly in the form of village elders and their associates who managed minor community matters that were outside the reach or interest of the central administration's district magistrates. These local figures took care of the day-to-day concerns of villagers, handling small disputes or practical issues that the higher officials left alone. Turning to the military system, the early agricultural settlers in China were peaceful people who initially had no standing army. When conflict arose, ordinary farmers would temporarily lay aside their farming tools, trading plowshares for swords, bows, and arrows, and gather as soldiers. In the periods between harvests, when fields were free of crops, these farmers would practice military exercises and prepare for war. The king himself commanded the military forces, which consisted of 6 armies led by 6 high-ranking nobles. The king was not only a military leader, but also a spiritual figure. He led troops into battle, accompanied by spirit tablets representing his ancestors and the gods of land and grain, underscoring the religious and cultural significance of warfare in Chinese society. Chariots played an important role on the battlefield, pulled by teams of 4 horses and carrying soldiers and commanders. These war chariots were symbols of power and mobility, combining speed and strength. The military structure was closely tied to the social hierarchy and religious beliefs of the time. reflecting how deeply integrated warfare was with the culture and governance. This early system was based on citizen soldiers rather than a professional standing army, and the agricultural calendar influenced military readiness and activity. As Chinese civilization evolved, so did its military organization. But the origins lay in these simple beginnings where every able-bodied man was expected to defend his land and community, and the king embodied both political and spiritual authority over the forces that protected the kingdom. In ancient China, soldiers were equipped with spears, javelins, and bows, and chariots carrying warriors formed a crucial part of the army. Archers, spearmen, and charioteers worked together in battle formations that were carefully planned for effectiveness. Typically, 1,000 chariots made up a regular fighting force, each chariot driven by horses and manned by warriors who sometimes wore buskins on their legs to protect themselves and improve mobility. In some cases, warriors were gagged during battles to prevent them from accidentally alerting the enemy with their cries or noises. In the thick of action, the chariots would take their position in the center. Bowmen held the left flank to launch arrows, while the spearmen guarded the right flank with their long weapons ready for close combat. Occasionally, elephants were used as living tanks, charging into enemy lines and breaking their formations. Alongside these forces, a variety of tools and signals were used in warfare. Spy kites flew high above to observe enemy movements from afar. Signal flags conveyed orders across the battlefield. Hook ladders were used for scaling walls during sieges. The cacophony of horns, cymbals, and drums kept the rhythm of battle and communicated commands to the soldiers below. Beacon fires were lit as warning signals or to announce victories. The grim reality of warfare was reflected in the brutal practice of taking the ears of defeated enemies and presenting them to the king as trophies, showing that mercy was rarely, if ever, given in these bloody conflicts. When the absolute monarchical government was established, standing armies became the norm rather than the temporary militias of earlier times. Military science grew in importance, and soldiers sometimes underwent rigorous training lasting up to 7 years to master the arts of war. The fighting chariots evolved too, now featuring upper levels or spy towers that allowed warriors to fight more effectively in narrow mountain passes or tight spaces. Battle formations became more sophisticated, with hollow squares formed by a mix of chariots, infantry, and mounted soldiers known as dragoons, who fought on horseback but could also dismount to fight as foot soldiers. Commanders understood well that dividing their forces could lead to disaster, so coordination and unity in battle were essential. By the 6th century AD, the military could muster huge forces numbering around 1,250,000 troops. In the year 627 AD, the standing army was well organized and efficient, consisting of 900,000 soldiers serving from ages 20 to 60, indicating a long period of military service expected from the men of the empire. The Mongol dynasty, ruling from 1280 to 1368, brought dramatic changes to Chinese warfare, revolutionizing tactics and improving the military knowledge inherited from previous eras. They developed a navy of 5,000 ships manned by 70,000 trained fighters, a significant force capable of projecting power across the seas. The Manchus, who took control in the 17th century, established the 8-banner system in 1614, composed of Manchu, Mongolian, and Chinese soldiers organized into military and social units. This system remained central to their military structure. Provincial forces were known as the Army of the Green Standard and included both land and marine units, although in active combat they were often replaced by irregular forces called braves or young, who were recruited and released as needed for specific campaigns. The defeat in the war with Japan in 1894 served as a harsh wake-up call, prompting serious military reforms. These changes modernized the Army's uniforms, weapons, and tactics, transforming it into a fighting force that could no longer be dismissed lightly in the global context. The Navy also began a process of modernization, acquiring new ships through building and purchase to protect China's long coastline and maritime interests. Despite these improvements, the soldiers' role in Chinese society remained complicated. For many centuries, soldiers, like priests, were seen as unproductive and often treated with disdain. Their social status was low because they did not engage in agriculture or crafts that directly produced goods. However, with the increasing recognition of the importance of defense, soldiers were now tasked not only with fighting actual enemies, but also with resisting subtler threats from foreign powers, which aimed to influence or control China's military affairs. There was a pressing need for China to protect itself from losing sovereignty over its military system, a danger that seemed as real as any physical invasion. Some believed that Western nations had a responsibility to act before it was too late, and a great disaster befell the country. Religion and spiritual matters were closely linked to governance and social order in ancient China. The earliest priests, called Wu, were known for their dancing and chanting during exorcisms, rituals meant to drive away evil spirits and bring about healing or favorable conditions. These Wu priests performed their ceremonies in temples where gods were worshipped and sacrifices made, but there was no separate priestly class as in other ancient cultures. The worship of heaven, considered the highest spiritual power, was reserved for the king or emperor alone, who acted as a bridge between the people and the divine. Thus, political and religious duties were not fully separated. The king held the role of Pontifex Maximus, or chief priest, while nobles, statesmen, and officials, both civil and military, performed priestly functions within their ranks. These ranks mirrored the political hierarchy, reinforcing the unity of spiritual and governmental power. Worship ceremonies were held in the Hall of Light, a multifunctional space that served as palace, audience hall, and council chamber. Here, sacrifices were made to heaven to ensure divine favor on the ruler and the kingdom, reflecting the belief that the welfare of the land was directly linked to the king's relationship with the gods. This blending of political authority and religious responsibility gave the king immense power, making him not just a ruler, but a spiritual leader whose legitimacy depended on maintaining harmony between heaven, earth, and the people. The practices surrounding worship and governance were deeply intertwined, shaping the character and structure of Chinese society throughout its long history. In ancient China, worship was deeply connected to the land itself, the hills, rivers, ancestors, and countless spirits that were believed to influence the world of the living. Dancing played a central role in these ceremonies, a vital and visible expression of reverence and communication with the divine. From the earliest times, idols were used as focal points of worship, embodying the spiritual forces the people honored. As religious practices evolved from their roots in ancestor worship, distinct religions developed their own sacred places, functionaries, rituals, and ceremonies. For example, at the state worship ceremonies dedicated to heaven, nature, and other cosmic forces, there were carefully ranked sacrifices categorized as great, medium, and inferior. These offerings included animals, silk, grains, and jade, each with its own significance, and placed with great care. During these ceremonies, panegyrics, formal songs of praise, were sung, and the participants wore robes of specific colors to reflect the solemnity and purpose of the occasion. The seasons themselves marked important moments for sacrifice, with ceremonies held in spring, summer, autumn, and winter at the appropriate altars, honoring the changing cycle of nature and seeking harmony between humans and the forces that governed their lives. Alongside the official state religion, Taoism and Buddhism each developed their own networks of temples, monasteries, priests, and ritual practices. Village and wayside shrines dotted the countryside, dedicated to a variety of deities and spirits connected to thunder, rain, wind, grain, agriculture, and other vital aspects of daily life. These religions experienced cycles of encouragement, tolerance, and persecution throughout history, but endured into modern times with elaborate hierarchies and priesthoods firmly established. Their temples and priests continued to serve the spiritual needs of the people alongside the official Confucian worship of ancestors, creating what came to be known as the Three Religions, or Sanqiao. Various annual festivals, such as a day akin to All Souls' Day, were observed to honor wandering and hungry ghosts, reflecting the deep concern for spiritual well-being that permeated the culture. The emperor, as the highest spiritual leader, bore the burden of calamities befalling the land, often making personal confession to heaven, and praying that any punishment or misfortune would fall upon him rather than the people. High officials and nobles were also expected to perform priestly duties connected to the state religion, blending their political responsibilities with sacred roles. Despite this, ordinary priests were often looked down upon because they did not contribute to production or labor. They were usually drawn from the lower social classes and were commonly celibate, uneducated, idle, and sometimes immoral, according to critics of the time. Even in the elaborate Buddhist ceremonies, there was no practice comparable to Western-style public worship or common prayer. Instead, worship in China was mainly a practical affair focused on obtaining good outcomes or avoiding evil, rather than communal religious experience. This pattern largely continued under the Republican regime, where religious observance declined somewhat, and many temples were converted into schools, reflecting changing social priorities. Alongside religious and ceremonial life, a variety of professional institutions existed throughout Chinese history. During the feudal period, many professions, such as physicians, blind musicians, poets, teachers, prayer makers, architects, scribes, painters, diviners, ceremonialists, and orators, were often closely tied to religious institutions or functions. These roles were not yet fully distinct from the church, and it was common for individuals to combine several roles. For example, historiographers might serve as statesmen, scholars, authors, and military generals all at once. Similarly, poets and teachers, musicians and writers were often united in a single person, blending artistic, educational, and spiritual duties. This tradition continued well into modern times. Priests sometimes provided medical care, while poets continued to sing their verses as part of ritual or cultural life. Experienced medical specialists existed, but were few, and women doctors could also be found. Other professionals included veterinary surgeons, musicians, often blind and belonging to the poorest classes, actors, teachers, attorneys, diviners, artists, letter writers, and many others. These people belonged to a broad category of individuals engaged in various arts and crafts, many of which had ecclesiastical or religious origins, but gradually took on more secular and specialized forms. The blending of religious, artistic, and practical roles was a distinctive feature of Chinese society, reflecting a culture where spiritual and everyday life were closely interwoven. Thus, through centuries of change, the Chinese people maintained a rich tapestry of religious practices and professional vocations that shaped their social and cultural identity. In ancient China, the pursuit of knowledge was highly esteemed, especially the mastery of letters, which stood as the most prominent and respected skill among the learned classes. From early times, a vast and intricate system of educational institutions developed throughout the land. These included schools, academies, colleges, and universities that existed not only in the great cities, but also in villages, districts, departments, and principalities. The educational instruction was broadly divided into two parts: primary learning, which laid the foundation of basic knowledge, and great learning, which focused on advanced study, mainly of classical texts and moral teachings. Special schools also existed for the arts of dancing and music, reflecting the cultural importance of these disciplines. Libraries served as repositories of knowledge, while almshouses provided care for elderly men, showing a concern for social welfare alongside education. Associations of scholars were numerous and often dedicated to literary pursuits, fostering communities where knowledge and culture flourished. However, education soon became heavily focused and restricted in its scope. The path to official government positions, prized above all else, was tightly linked to mastery of the classical writings of the ancient sages. It was considered essential to be thoroughly versed in the sayings and teachings of Confucius, Mencius, and other revered thinkers, as well as being able to compose flawless essays that contained not a single wrongly written character. This intense focus on classical learning, however, came at the expense of any other form of knowledge. For those aspiring to join the official class, which was nearly synonymous with the educated literary class, there was little room or encouragement to explore subjects beyond the classics. This literary obsession permeated the national consciousness to such an extent that even infant spines were deliberately bent during early childhood, so that as adults they would naturally have the characteristic stoop of the scholar, a physical symbol of their devotion to study and scholarly pursuits. Outside this elite class, the vast majority of the population consisted of agriculturists, artisans, and merchants, each group inheriting its knowledge and skills from previous generations. Sons learned the same trades and methods as their fathers and grandfathers, continuing in the groove that fate had assigned them. Any departure from this expected path was seen as unfilial unless the individual's efforts led to admission into the scholar official class through success in the classical studies and examinations, which then brought honor and glory to the entire family. This deeply ingrained system shaped education for centuries, making it a rote learning process focused on memorizing elementary textbooks and then the complete works of Confucius and other classical writers. Students spent years committing these texts to memory, with little encouragement to pursue broader or more practical knowledge. This educational model remained largely unchanged until 1905, when the old system of competitive examinations was abolished and replaced by modern education systems throughout the country. Schools, colleges, and universities began teaching a wide range of subjects based on modern knowledge, introducing new ideas and methods that would rejuvenate Chinese society. This transformation is creating a powerful force that is regenerating the Chinese people and will have far-reaching effects across the world. The long-standing respect and desire for learning in Chinese culture, combined with this modern education movement, promise to make China a truly great nation. It is hoped that this new emphasis on knowledge will prevent the rigid class divisions and disdain for learning that have plagued some Western countries, and will instead establish an aristocracy of learning, where merit and scholarship are the highest honors, much like what has been seen in places such as the United States. Alongside these educational institutions, ancient China also developed a variety of other social institutions to care for those in need and manage communal resources. Poor relief systems were established to provide aid for the destitute and vulnerable. Hospitals offered medical care, and foundling hospitals and orphan asylums cared for abandoned children, reflecting a social concern for those unable to care for themselves. Banking institutions also emerged, facilitating the management of money and credit within communities. These accessory institutions, alongside the schools and academies, formed a complex and integrated social framework that supported both intellectual and practical needs. The intertwining of education with social welfare and professional development created a society where knowledge and care for the community were valued and institutionalized, even if the scope of education remained narrow for many centuries. Together, these institutions laid the groundwork for a society that prized learning and cultural continuity, while also providing mechanisms to support and uplift its people through education, care, and social organization. Throughout Chinese history, alongside its deeply rooted educational and social systems, there were numerous other institutions developed to support the needs of the people and the community. These included insurance and loan associations, which helped individuals manage risk and obtain financial support. Travelers' clubs provided safe havens and companionship for those journeying across the vast empire, while mercantile corporations organized and regulated trade and commerce. Anti-opium societies emerged in response to the widespread addiction problem, aiming to combat and reduce the influence of the opium trade. Cooperative burial societies were also established to assist families in performing funeral rites and ensuring respectful burials, relieving individuals of the heavy financial burden. Many of these institutions reflected Chinese traditions, but others were clearly imitated from Western models, showing a gradual blending of ideas as foreign contact increased over time. In terms of bodily practices, the Chinese inflicted relatively few mutilations compared to many primitive peoples, but some customs stand out as particularly distinctive and telling about the culture. From infancy, some infants' skulls were flattened using stones, causing the head to taper at the top, a physical alteration that was considered desirable in certain times and places. Beyond these early life modifications, the Chinese also practiced certain mutilations related to warfare, legal punishments, and personal acts of loyalty and devotion. Filial children and loyal wives sometimes went to extreme lengths to demonstrate their dedication by self-mutilation, hoping to cure their parents' illnesses or to prevent a widow from remarrying, acts which carried profound social and spiritual significance. Eunuchs, men who were castrated, were numerous, serving in important positions within the imperial court and administration. People also marked themselves by biting, cutting, or tattooing their arms to seal oaths or pledges, physical signs of promises that carried deep meaning. Two practices especially associated with Chinese culture are foot binding for women and the wearing of the queue hairstyle by men, though both are forms of physical constraint and control, imposed either by social pressure or political domination. Foot binding, the compression of women's feet, is known to have been practiced around the year 934 AD, though some sources suggest it may have started as early as 583. However, it took more than a century for the practice to become firmly established and widely accepted. This extremely painful custom began in infancy and was meant to deform the feet to a very small size, a standard of beauty and status that was rigidly enforced. The origin story suggests that it started as a fashion among women trying to imitate the small feet of an imperial concubine admired by an emperor centuries ago, illustrating how deeply fashion and social pressures could override the natural well-being of individuals. The second custom, the queue, or so-called pigtail, was a hairstyle imposed by the conquering Manchu rulers in the 17th century. The queue was a symbol of submission and servitude, forcing the Han Chinese men to shave the front of their heads and wear the rest of their hair in a long braid. This hairstyle was deeply resented but rigorously enforced by law, making it a visible mark of subjugation. Both these practices, the binding of feet and the wearing of the queue, were officially discouraged by government edicts in later years and are now gradually disappearing. The queue was legally abolished with the fall of the Manchu dynasty in 1912, but even today, remnants of these old customs can still be seen in some towns and villages. When it came to death and funeral rites, the Chinese had a complex understanding shaped by their beliefs about the soul and the afterlife. They did not see death as a final end, but rather as a state of suspended animation, where the soul had temporarily failed to return to the body but might do so after some time. Because of this belief, they delayed burial for a period, during which they would care for the corpse as if it were still alive. They fed the dead and called out to the spirit from the rooftops, hoping to coax it back to the body. Only when it became clear that the spirit would not return did they finally place the body in a coffin for burial. But even then, the burial was not a simple matter. The deceased was provided with everything believed necessary for the next life, including food, clothing, and even wives and servants. This was because the afterlife was viewed as a continuation of the present life rather than a wholly different existence, so all earthly needs had to be met. During the funeral procession, a soul tablet was created and dotted, a ritual in which the character for prince was changed to mean lord, symbolically inducting or persuading the spirit to enter this tablet. This tablet was then carried back to the family home and placed in a shrine in the main hall. Family members would then bow and worship before it, acknowledging the union of the deceased with their ancestors and continuing the bond between the living and the dead. These practices surrounding death were deeply intertwined with ideas of family loyalty, social status, and spiritual belief. They emphasized the continuing importance of ancestors and the ongoing relationship between the living and those who had passed on. Funerary customs reinforced the idea that the family did not end with death, but stretched backward through generations and forward into eternity, with the living responsible for maintaining the spirit's comfort and honor. The elaborate ceremonies and preparations were also an expression of respect and a way to maintain social order, ensuring that the spirits were properly cared for to prevent misfortune or unrest in the world of the living. Altogether, these cultural institutions and customs, from education to social welfare, from bodily practices to death rites, paint a picture of a society where tradition, respect for authority, family loyalty, and social hierarchy were central, and where change was slow but inevitable, especially as new ideas and influences began to penetrate the old ways. The spirit was carefully worshipped and honored, and as long as the family made sure that occasional offerings were not forgotten or overlooked, the spirit's power for evil would not be directed against the surviving members of the household whom it had once carelessly abandoned. The family mourned deeply for their lost relative, expressing their grief in loud and intense ways. They screamed and wailed, stamped their feet on the ground, and beat their breasts to show sorrow. In the earliest times, their mourning was so severe that they would renounce their usual belongings, giving up their clothes, homes, and possessions to the dead, and would live temporarily in simple mourning sheds made of clay. During this time, they fasted or ate only plain rice gruel, slept on straw mats with a clod of earth as a pillow, and spoke only of matters related to death and burial. Those in mourning gave up all official duties and public roles. They avoided marriage, music, and even separation from their clan, understanding that such activities were inappropriate during a time of loss. Over the many centuries of monarchical rule, these funeral rites grew more elaborate and grand, but even after the Republic was established, and though the ceremonies became less rigid and ceremonious, they kept their core meaning and practices right up to modern times. Funeral ceremonies became more demanding than most other events, including marriage celebrations. Invitations or notifications, called fu, were sent out to friends and relatives, telling them the dates of mourning events. On these appointed days, guests were expected not only to attend, but to bring gifts such as money, paper horses, or paper slaves, symbolic offerings for the spirit world. They would join in the lamentations sung by professional mourners and be present at prayers led by priests. The etiquette surrounding funerals was strict and could not be corrected or made right later if missed or ignored, unlike marriage ceremonies, where overlooked details might be fixed afterward. The funeral had to be properly observed at the correct time to maintain respect for the deceased and ensure peace for the living. Instead of having large public cemeteries arranged in neat rows, as in the West, Chinese cemeteries typically belong to families or clans. These cemeteries were often beautiful and peaceful spaces, planted with trees and enclosed by artistic walls that surrounded the grave mounds and monumental tablets. The cemeteries themselves symbolized the family or village, standing as physical reminders of heritage and belonging. In the northern parts of the country, it was common for graves to be marked by a large marble tortoise statue bearing an inscribed tablet, similar to a gravestone, on its back. The tombs of the last imperial families, like those of the Ming and Manchu dynasties, were especially magnificent. They covered vast areas and were artistically placed on hillsides overlooking natural or artificial lakes or seas, blending the grandeur of architecture with the beauty of nature. However, unlike in Egypt, where many ancient tombs have been preserved, the conquerors of China often destroyed the tombs of their predecessors. This harsh practice meant that many imperial tombs were lost, and if it had not been for this destruction, China would probably have had the most magnificent collection of royal tombs in history. Throughout all their history, the Chinese people have placed an extreme emphasis on ceremonial observances, pushing ritual and protocol to remarkable lengths. According to one of their great classical books on ceremonies, the Li Qi, ceremonies are the greatest things by which humans live. This means that, in their view, the proper way to behave, The correct display of respect and honor through ceremonies was the foundation of society and human interaction. Social ranks were clearly distinguished through various outward signs and symbols, such as different styles of headdresses, specific garments, badges, weapons, writing tablets, the number of attendants a person had, the kind of carriages and horses they used, and even the height of the walls around their homes. Every day, as well as official events, were governed by a strict code of detailed observances. These rules and customs were written down, covering nearly every posture and act that inferiors should show toward superiors, and vice versa. This comprehensive set of rules created a rigid structure within society, making sure that everyone knew their place and acted accordingly. For example, how a servant should bow to a lord, how a junior official should greet a senior one, or how a son should address his father were all precisely regulated. Even the smallest gesture could carry deep meaning and was significant in maintaining social harmony. The meticulousness of these rules extended to private life and public life alike, demonstrating the enormous importance placed on respect, order, and ritual in Chinese culture. This emphasis on ceremony and respect formed the foundation of Chinese social interactions for thousands of years, and the effects are still visible today in various traditions and customs. It was through these detailed codes that the Chinese people created a society that valued hierarchy, discipline, and decorum, all of which were seen as necessary for the welfare of both individuals and the state. Despite many changes through the ages, this core respect for ceremony and order remains a defining characteristic of Chinese cultural identity. Every interaction in Chinese society was governed by precise rules that covered how people behaved toward those below them in rank, as well as how equals treated one another. Visits, greetings, and the giving of presents all followed strict formulas known and carefully observed by everyone, just like how every child in China memorized and recited aloud the simple three-word sentences of the elementary trimetrical classic in school. Yet, while the school textbook was simple and easy to learn, the rules of ceremony were incredibly detailed and complicated, forming a vast system that controlled much of daily life. In this way, a Chinese person was as much a servant to the living around him in his daily conduct as he was a servant to the dead in the strict funeral rites he followed. Over centuries, these ceremonies created a deep structure of social order, and only recently, with the rapid rise of modern progress, has the old and humble act of bowing deeply or performing the kowtow slowly been replaced by the simpler Western custom of just doffing the hat. This difference in ceremonial customs has been a major source of misunderstanding between East and West for centuries, and even today, where the rules of etiquette are not only different but often the exact opposite, the risk of confusion and offense remains high. Many Westerners know about the more famous and symbolic acts like kowtowing to the emperor or the worship of ancestors, but most remain unaware that to truly follow Chinese manners when visiting China, instead of resorting to Western habits which are sadly replacing many traditions, one should not remove their hat upon entering a house or temple, should not shake hands with their host, and should avoid clapping to show approval. In traditional Chinese culture, clapping is not a sign of praise, but a means to drive away sha qi, the harmful, deathly energy of evil spirits. Clapping after a Chinese host's speech, as Western visitors often do with good intentions, can actually be interpreted as a sign of disapproval or even insult. Had Western diplomats approached these differences with the mindset of sociologists instead of purely commercial negotiators, many conflicts might have been avoided through better cultural understanding. The habits and customs of the Chinese people extended well beyond daily etiquette to encompass a full calendar of festivals and public celebrations that marked the passing of the year. The most important of these was the celebration of the New Year, which burst forth with the noise and color of countless firecrackers, symbolizing the driving away of evil spirits and bad luck. Families rejoiced with feasting and drinking while visiting friends and relatives over many days. Before the new year began, It was customary to settle all debts and accounts, as well as to thoroughly clean homes, symbolically washing away the past year's misfortunes. Bright paper decorations featuring images of door gods were pasted on the front doors for protection, and red strips of paper with characters meaning happiness, wealth, good fortune, and long life were affixed to doorposts, lintels, and tables. Everything from doorways to dining tables was covered with red cloth, and flowers and decorative items brightened the homes and streets alike. Business stopped completely for this period, allowing people to fully enjoy the merriment. Dressing in new clothes, eating special foods, paying respects to gods and ancestors, and relaxing through visiting and idling were all part of the joyful atmosphere that lasted throughout the first half of the first lunar month. This extended holiday season reached its grand conclusion with the Feast of Lanterns, a festival that had its origins over 2,000 years ago during the Han Dynasty. During the Feast of Lanterns, for 3 full days, countless lanterns of every size, shape, and color were lit in front of both public buildings and private homes. These lanterns were beautifully crafted and came in a variety of designs, but with one important rule: none could be completely white or undyed, because white was the color of mourning. The lanterns symbolized light, life, and hope, driving away darkness and evil influences as the community celebrated the brightness of life. The streets and homes would glow with the warm light of these lanterns, creating a magical atmosphere of unity and festivity. This annual event brought people together across regions and social classes to share in the joy of renewal and the promise of good fortune for the year ahead. It was a time when the past was respectfully honored and new beginnings were embraced with enthusiasm and hope. Through these ceremonies and customs, the Chinese people wove a continuous thread connecting their history, beliefs, and society. The importance of ritual and respect in their lives went far beyond mere formality. It was the foundation of social order and personal identity. Whether in the strict rules governing everyday interactions, the reverent observance of funeral rites, or the vibrant celebrations of the New Year and lantern festivals, every act was charged with meaning. These observances helped maintain harmony within families, communities, and the state, creating a society deeply rooted in tradition and respect for both the past and the present. Even as the world changes and new influences arrive, these enduring customs continue to shape Chinese culture, reminding all who live there of the strength and beauty found in ceremony, connection, and shared heritage. Among the many festivals celebrated in China, the Feast of Lanterns holds a special place and has evolved over centuries. One of its most famous features, added about 800 years after the festival first began, roughly 1,200 years ago, is the majestic procession of paper dragons. These dragons can stretch hundreds of yards, twisting and turning slowly along the streets, carried on the heads of men whose legs are the only visible parts, creating the magical illusion of enormous serpents slithering through the thoroughfares. This striking display is a symbol of power and good fortune, captivating all who witness it. Beyond the Feast of Lanterns, there are several other important festivals that mark the Chinese calendar, about 8 major ones in total, not including the seasonal festivals tied to the equinoxes and solstices. 4 of these are especially dedicated to honoring and propitiating the spirits, demonstrating the deep connection between the living and the dead in Chinese culture. The earliest of these spirit festivals is the Earlier Spirit Festival, held on the 15th day of the 2nd lunar month, followed by the Festival of the Tombs, which takes place around the 3rd day of the 3rd lunar month. During this time, families visit and tend to the graves of their ancestors, cleaning and repairing them, and offering special gifts to show respect and ensure the well-being of the spirits in the afterlife. Then there is the Middle Spirit Festival on the 15th day of the 7th moon, and finally, the Later Spirit Festival on the 15th day of the 10th moon, both continuing the tradition of remembering and honoring ancestors through various rites and offerings. One of the most vivid and lively of the traditional festivals is the Dragon Boat Festival, celebrated on the 5th day of the 5th moon. This festival is said to have originated as a commemoration of a great poet who drowned himself in despair over the corruption and intrigue in the government, a powerful symbol of protest and sorrow. Over time, the festival's focus shifted to invoking good rains to guarantee a bountiful harvest, an essential concern for the agricultural society. The celebration includes thrilling races in long, narrow boats shaped like dragons, powered by dozens of rowers, symbolizing strength and unity. People also paste protective charms on their doors to ward off evil and eat a special type of rice cake while drinking a unique liquor, adding flavor and tradition to the day. Another important occasion is the Mid-Autumn Festival, which falls on the 15th day of the 8th moon and is often called All Souls' Day by foreigners. On this day, women pay homage to the moon, offering cakes and fruit, symbolizing beauty, fertility, and harmony. The gates of purgatory are believed to open during this time, allowing the hungry ghosts, spirits without rest, to come out and enjoy the offerings made by the living for an entire month, a haunting yet deeply meaningful custom showing care for those beyond life. The 9th day of the 9th moon brings the Chongyang Festival, a day when everyone who can makes the effort to climb to a high place, such as a hill or temple tower, symbolizing the pursuit of longevity and strength. This day also marks the beginning of the kite flying season, which lasts for several months. The sky becomes a lively scene filled with kites shaped like dragons, centipedes, frogs, butterflies, and many other imaginative creatures. These kites are not simple toys, but intricate creations that move realistically with the wind, rolling their eyes, making sounds, and fluttering wings or tails, bringing the sky to life in a spectacle of color and motion. The origin of this festival traces back to a scholar who was warned by his master of a terrible disaster about to strike. Acting on the advice, he fled with his family to a high place, escaping harm while his animals died in his absence, believed to have sacrificed themselves in his stead. This story of survival and protection is commemorated through the ritual of climbing high places and flying kites, blending mythology and practical hope for a long and healthy life. The Chinese New Year, also known as Tuan Nian or Chu Shi, holds a particularly significant place in the yearly cycle of festivals. On New Year's Eve, the kitchen god, a figure believed to watch over the family's household affairs, ascends to heaven to report on the family's behavior over the past year. To influence the report, families prepare sticky foods like honey to place on his lips, hoping to keep him from speaking ill of them and to secure good fortune for the year ahead. This ritual reveals how deeply intertwined daily life and spiritual beliefs are in Chinese culture, where even the smallest details are imbued with meaning and intention. Throughout all these festivals, the emphasis on honoring ancestors, celebrating nature's cycles, and fostering community bonds remains strong, revealing a rich tapestry of customs that have been preserved and passed down through countless generations. Together, these festivals form the heartbeat of Chinese cultural life, connecting the past with the present and offering a shared space for joy, remembrance, and hope. The earliest forms of sport in China were closely tied to festivals where people gathered to practice archery, a skill highly valued and celebrated. Over time, these archery exercises evolved into more military-style training, reflecting the importance of defense and combat readiness in ancient society. Hunting was a popular pastime, not only for food, but as a form of recreation and skill sharpening. Beyond physical contests, the Chinese also enjoyed games of the mind and chance, such as calculation games and chess, often called the game of war because of its strategic nature. Other popular games included shuttlecock, played with the feet where players kicked a weighted object into the air, and pitchpot, which involved throwing arrows into a narrow-necked jar, a test of precision and focus. There was also a game known as horn-goring, where participants, mounted on the shoulders of others, wore horned masks and engaged in mock combat, a playful but physically demanding activity. Over the years, many games fell out of favor, replaced by new inventions that kept the spirit of competition and entertainment alive. Near the end of the monarchical era, during the Manchu dynasty, some of the most common sports included foot shuttlecock, where players kicked a shuttlecock with skill and agility, lifting heavy stone-headed beams similar to dumbbells, often weighing 30 to 40 pounds and stretching 4 feet long, showcasing strength and endurance. Kite flying, a favorite pastime that combined artistry and technical skill. Quail and cricket fighting, where these small animals were pitted against one another for sport. And sending trained birds after seeds thrown in the air, a unique game requiring patience and timing. Other leisurely activities included wandering through fields for pleasure, playing chess or mora, a type of hand game, and gambling using cards, dice, or betting on animal fights and seed-catching birds. Children's games were plentiful and diverse, designed not only for fun, but also to develop physical strength, quick reflexes, sharp minds, a sense of care for others, accuracy, and cleverness. In the world of entertainment, theatrical performances were common, with traveling troupes performing on temporary stages near temples, though more permanent theaters also existed in some cities. Traditionally, male actors performed female roles, a custom that persisted until recent times. Besides theater, people were entertained by peep shows, conjurers performing magic tricks, ventriloquists, acrobats displaying their physical skills, fortune tellers predicting futures, and storytellers captivating audiences with tales. In modern times, the youth who embrace progress and change tend to enjoy many outdoor games borrowed from the West, but have been slower to adopt indoor games, holding on to some traditional pastimes. In the realm of domestic life, the Chinese maintained elaborate customs and superstitions around important life events such as birth, betrothal, and marriage. Families observed detailed rituals to mark these occasions, ensuring that traditions were honored and blessings secured. The daily routine often began early, with many people rising with the sun to start their day. Personal grooming was an important part of daily life, with barbers providing services such as shaving the head and beard, cleaning ears, and giving massages. Public bathhouses were common in cities and towns, serving as social centers where people not only cleaned themselves but also connected with others in the community. Shops typically closed at nightfall, and since streets were poorly lit or sometimes unlit, people traveling after dark often carried lanterns, either themselves or with the help of attendants. Safety was a concern in many places, leading most houses, except the poorest, to employ private watchmen who guarded homes during the night. Meals were usually taken twice a day, and social dinners often took place at inns or restaurants, where guests enjoyed not only food, but also musical and theatrical performances. Western sources sometimes claim that the place of honor at a table is on the left side, but in reality, it depended on the need to protect the guest. The seat of highest respect was usually the one facing the door, allowing the guest to see anyone entering and be prepared in case of danger. This practical approach to hospitality showed how much value was placed on safety and awareness. Pets were common in many households, with lapdogs and cage birds being favored companions. The huangku, or yellow dog, also known as wonks, served as guards for homes and sometimes acted as street scavengers, helping to keep the neighborhood clean. Among wealthier and middle-class families, it was common to have aquariums filled with goldfish, which were prized for their beauty and tranquility. Gardens and courtyards often contained carefully arranged rockeries, shrubs, and flowers, creating peaceful and artistic outdoor spaces. An interesting personal grooming detail was that whiskers were never worn, reflecting particular cultural preferences regarding appearance. In this way, everyday life was filled with rich customs, practical habits, and a strong sense of community, where tradition and function blended seamlessly. From sports that tested both body and mind, to domestic routines rooted in respect and care, the Chinese way of life reflected a deep connection to history, nature, and social order, even as it faced changes and challenges over time. In traditional Chinese society, personal grooming and appearance followed very distinct customs and reflected deeper cultural values. Mustaches and beards were rarely seen on men before the age of 40, since the hair on the face grew very thinly or not at all during youth. Even as men aged, full, thick beards like those common in the West were practically unknown. Instead, facial hair was usually sparse and modest throughout life. Both men and women carried small personal items like snuff bottles, tobacco pipes, and fans, which were both practical and sometimes decorative. Among the literary and leisured classes, long fingernails were common, symbolizing a life free from manual labor. Women, especially those not of Manchu descent, were known for the practice of foot binding, which caused their feet to become painfully small and cramped from a young age, while both Manchu and Chinese women used cosmetics liberally to enhance their appearance. On the industrial and labor side, traditional roles were quite clearly divided between men and women, following what might be called a primitive division of labor that persisted through the centuries. Men primarily took charge of farming and field work, while women cared for mulberry orchards, tended silkworms, and carried out tasks such as spinning silk, weaving cloth, and embroidering delicate patterns. Over time, women's responsibilities expanded beyond these to include some field labor, mending worn-out clothing, drilling and sharpening needles, pasting tinfoil, making shoes, and carefully gathering and sorting tea leaves. As society advanced, trades became highly specialized and localized, with entire regions or cities becoming known for particular crafts. For example, bankers gathered in the province of Shanxi, carpenters were concentrated in Chichu, and the manufacturing of porcelain was centered in Jiaoqiu, located in Jiangxi province. Land ownership was a central feature of the economic system, and from an early time, the land was considered the property of the sovereign or ruler. The ruler would farm out plots to relatives or favorites, organizing the land according to a system known as the Qing, or well system. This system divided land into 9 squares, 8 private plots arranged around a 9th public plot. The 8 farmer families would cultivate the central square together for the benefit of the state. This land tenure system, which persisted throughout the monarchical period, was fundamentally based on the crown's ownership. Land was not held outright by individuals, but mostly managed by clans or families, and it was not entailed in the way land ownership might be in other societies. Those who farmed the land paid an annual tax, a fee for transferring land rights, and sometimes money in exchange for personal government services, often incorporated as part of a direct tax known as scutage. Slavery was not part of the earliest periods of Chinese history, but became a recognized institution throughout the monarchical era, coexisting with the broader society. The economy largely depended on human and animal labor, as machinery was not widely used until very recent times. Goods and produce were distributed internally through a network of centers such as fairs, markets, and shops, allowing products from farms and workshops to reach consumers throughout the country. For over 2,000 years, the major trade routes by land and sea remained remarkably consistent, linking China with Western Asia, Greece, Rome, Carthage, and Arabia. Beginning in the 17th century, European countries became increasingly important trading partners. Traditional means of transport, such as humans carrying loads, animals, carts, and boats, were gradually supplemented by steamships starting around 1861, transforming trade and communication. Commerce in China was primarily conducted through barter in early times, with cowrie shells serving as a form of proto-currency before the introduction of coins. Coins were cast in varying amounts under each reign, but for much of history only one type of coin, the copper cash, was widely used. Bullion and paper notes were also accepted as forms of exchange, but these were less common. With the rise of foreign trade, silver Mexican dollars and subsidiary coins became more frequent in circulation, reflecting the influence of international commerce. The system of weights and measures was officially standardized to some extent and partly based on the decimal system. However, in everyday commercial life, people often ignored official standards, and the measures tended to decrease in size from north to south. This flexible approach suited the practical needs of merchants and traders who adapted their practices to local customs and conditions. In these ways, China's long history was marked by a balance of tradition and adaptation, whether in personal habits, social roles, land management, or trade. The way people looked after their bodies, the clear roles for men and women in work, the ownership and use of land, and the conduct of commerce all reflected a society deeply rooted in its past, yet capable of evolving. The intricate details of daily life, from grooming to farming to the markets, formed the fabric of a civilization that endured for thousands of years and left a rich legacy for the world. From the earliest days, the arts and crafts of China showed a wide range of development, reflecting both practical needs and a deep appreciation for beauty. Many mechanical arts such as hunting, fishing, cooking, weaving, dyeing, carpentry, metallurgy, glassmaking, brickmaking, papermaking, printing, and bookbinding were in relatively early stages, often simple in design and marked by imitation rather than innovation. These crafts, while important to daily life, did not yet reach great heights of sophistication. However, in contrast, the arts of pottery, carving, and lacquerwork stood out as exceptionally refined and well-developed. The objects produced in these fields were known for their quality and beauty, often surpassing similar works from other parts of the world. This shows that while some areas of craft were still developing, others had achieved remarkable mastery and artistic expression. Agriculture was the backbone of Chinese civilization from the very beginning. The majority of available land was put to use in farming, a practice that had continued almost without interruption for over 4,000 years. Even hillsides were carefully terraced to create more space for crops, demonstrating the ingenuity and hard work of farmers who sought to maximize every inch of arable land. Although war and poor governance sometimes led to neglect and land lying fallow, the general pattern was one of close attention and steady cultivation. In the northern regions, farmers typically harvested 2 crops each year, while in the south, the more favorable climate allowed for up to 5 crops in 2 years. Roughly 2/3 of the population worked the soil, making agriculture a central part of life and society. The methods used in farming remained largely traditional and simple. Despite this, the soil's natural fertility, combined with the farmer's diligence and careful use of fertilizers, made it possible to sustain an enormous population across a vast territory. A wide variety of crops were grown to meet the needs of the people. The chief grains included rice, wheat, barley, buckwheat, maize, kaoliang, a type of millet, several other millets, and oats. Besides grains, farmers cultivated beans, peas, and oil-bearing seeds such as sesame and rape. They also grew fiber plants like hemp, ramie, jute, and cotton, which were important for making textiles. Starch-rich roots like taros, yams, and sweet potatoes formed an important part of the diet as well. Additionally, crops such as tobacco, indigo for dyeing, tea, sugar, and various fruits were cultivated. While fruit growing was widespread, it often lacked scientific methods, relying more on traditional knowledge. Crop rotation, a practice common in other parts of the world to preserve soil fertility, was not widely used, but farmers were skilled in grafting, pruning, dwarfing, enlarging, selecting, and varying species to improve their harvest. Vegetable cultivation reached a high level of efficiency, with even the smallest patches of land producing abundant food. This achievement was especially notable given that most small farmers could not afford expensive or complicated foreign machinery, so they had to rely on manual labor and simple tools. Livestock rearing was another important aspect of agriculture. People raised a variety of animals suited to different tasks and needs. Pigs, asses, horses, mules, cows, sheep, goats, buffalo, yaks, fowl, ducks, geese, pigeons, silkworms, and bees were all commonly kept. These animals provided meat, milk, labor, transportation, silk, honey, and other resources vital to everyday life. In recent years, government bodies like the Ministry of Agriculture and Commerce, which followed earlier institutions such as the Board of Agriculture, Manufactures, and Commerce, began introducing Western farming techniques and innovations. These efforts aim to improve yields and modernize agriculture in China, promising even greater success in the future. Beyond practical matters, the Chinese have always shown a deep love for beauty and the arts. Their delight in flowers, music, poetry, literature, embroidery, paintings, and porcelain is well known. Ornamental plants were cultivated in nearly every household, and gardens were common, whether large or small. Tables often displayed flowers in vases or decorative wire baskets, along with fruits and sweetmeats to please the eye as well as the palate. The great thinker Confucius regarded music not just as entertainment, but as a powerful tool for governing and maintaining order. Written characters were held in such high respect that paper bearing them was never thrown on the ground or stepped on, symbolizing the reverence for knowledge and learning. The Chinese people found joy in beautiful natural scenery, and stories of the marvelous and religious or spiritual buildings were often placed in commanding or pleasant locations to enhance their meaning and effect. However, until quite recently, many streets and houses were generally unclean and untidy. Despite the love of beauty and order expressed in many ways, practical cleanliness and hygiene were sometimes neglected. This contrast between a deep appreciation of the beautiful and the lack of cleanliness was a feature of traditional life. Nevertheless, the overall picture is one of a culture that cherished artistic expression and moral values, while continuing to rely on the hard work of farmers and craftsmen to sustain a vast and complex society. In all, this mix of primitive mechanical arts with highly developed crafts, the careful cultivation of land and livestock, and the love for beauty and order combined to create a rich and enduring civilization. This civilization thrived for millennia, sustained by its people's ingenuity, dedication, and appreciation for both the practical and the beautiful aspects of life. In traditional Chinese society, morality was a complex and often contradictory affair. Public opinion generally favored moral behavior, and there was a strong sense that people should act with decency and respect toward one another. However, in daily life, the reality was often quite different. Marriages were arranged early, and the practice of concubinage was common. Yet, despite these social structures, there was considerable laxity in personal conduct. Cruelty, both to humans and animals, was sadly a common trait seen throughout history, with episodes of harshness and brutality marking warfare and even everyday interactions. The earliest times recorded savagery on the battlefield, acts of cannibalism, and widespread indulgence in luxury, drunkenness, and corruption among the ruling classes and common people alike. Women in society were often treated harshly and held in a despotic position with few rights or freedoms. At the same time, moral principles were deeply embedded in classical literature, and these teachings served as the foundation for laws and social expectations, though in practice, enforcement varied greatly. Revenge, considered a lower or base emotion in many cultures, was not only accepted but even preached as a sacred duty, rooted in the yin-yang philosophy that dominated Chinese thought. This dualistic system, which sees all things in pairs of opposites, led to a lenient attitude toward immorality in some respects, tolerating behaviors that elsewhere might be harshly judged. In more recent times, certain virtues have become more prominent, particularly among the merchant class. The idea that a merchant's word is his bond is taken very seriously, and commercial honor holds a high place in society, sometimes even more than in many Western countries. Intemperance or excessive drinking has been relatively rare compared to other societies, although opium smoking became widespread until authorities took strong measures to suppress it between 1906 and 1916. Despite these efforts, smuggling of opium continued, and corruption among officials allowed the drug trade to persist in many areas. Clan rivalries and family feuds were another ongoing source of conflict, with vendettas sometimes lasting for generations, highlighting the importance of family loyalty, but also the destructive consequences of such disputes. Suicide, often seen as a last resort under unbearable injustice or despair, was not only tolerated, but sometimes honored as a noble act, reflecting a tragic acceptance of suffering in the face of social wrongs. A deep respect for parents and social superiors remained a fundamental value influencing personal behavior and social relationships. However, truthfulness was often sacrificed for convenience or gain. Lying or deception, when useful, was common and did not carry a strong sense of shame, even if discovered. Theft was also frequent, as many people struggled under heavy taxation and the burdens imposed by rulers who often abused their power. During times of prosperity, people showed pride and satisfaction in their material success, though this pride was sometimes short-sighted and could blind them to deeper issues. Politeness was almost universal in social interactions, although it was sometimes seen as superficial or formal rather than heartfelt. Gratitude, on the other hand, was genuine and widely felt among the people. Family bonds were strong, with mutual affection between husbands and wives being common, despite the social constraints placed on women. Gambling was a popular pastime, enjoyed across classes and regions, and remained a pervasive part of social life. Despite many of these long-standing traits, recent years have seen some changes. Education and the formation of societies dedicated to moral improvement have begun to challenge and modify the older behaviors. Groups have organized themselves with commitments to combat immorality, concubinage, gambling, drinking, and smoking, reflecting a growing awareness of the need for social reform. Religious beliefs in China were deeply intertwined with everyday life and the desire to influence the unseen world for practical benefits or to avoid harm. At its core, Chinese religion centered on an attitude towards spirits and gods, with rituals and practices aimed at gaining favor or protection. This religious outlook grew out of ancestor worship, which remains a central part of Chinese spiritual life even today. The state religion, Confucianism, was essentially a system of ancestor worship and reverence for the past, emphasizing filial piety and respect for tradition as the foundation of society. Taoism began as a philosophy, but gradually developed into a religion focused on the worship of spirits, believed to be the souls of dead people who had taken up residence in animals, reptiles, insects, trees, stones, and other parts of nature. Taoism eventually adopted religious forms and borrowed from Buddhism, although it faded in importance and transformed into a practice focused largely on exorcism and magical rites. Buddhism, which came into China from India as a fully formed religion, introduced new ideas about the soul and the afterlife. In this belief system, Buddha was once a man who attained enlightenment, and worship centered on him as a spiritual ideal. Unlike some religious systems with gods who wield ultimate power, Buddhism taught that no beings possess powers greater than those that human beings might achieve through spiritual practice. According to Buddhist thought, the soul does not remain fixed after death, but migrates or reincarnates, taking on forms that could range from a deified human to animals like elephants or birds, to plants, to inanimate objects such as walls or brooms, or even to ordinary pieces of matter. This fluid and wide-ranging view of existence added a different dimension to Chinese spirituality, blending with existing beliefs and rituals to create a rich, layered religious culture. Through all these shifting moral attitudes and religious practices, Chinese society remained complex and sometimes contradictory. The ideals of morality and filial piety existed alongside cruelty and corruption. The hope for spiritual favor coexisted with widespread social problems and human weaknesses. Yet, over time, education, reform movements, and new ideas have begun to influence these traditions, shaping a society still deeply rooted in its past, but open to change and renewal. Though Confucianism was the official state philosophy and deeply rooted in Chinese culture, other beliefs such as popular superstition and Taoism held a powerful sway over the common people. Taoism, with its teachings about a future state and the preservation of life, found a special place in the hearts of many because it addressed the spiritual needs that Confucianism often overlooked. While Confucianism focused on social order, respect for ancestors, and proper conduct in this life, it lacked a strong doctrine about what happens after death, leaving a spiritual gap that Taoism filled. Taoism's calls for compassion and care for life offered a kind of hope and comfort to those struggling with hardship and loss, and many took refuge in its teachings. Without Taoism's influence, conditions could have been far harsher for many people, lacking even this form of spiritual solace. However, religion, apart from the deep-rooted practice of ancestor worship, did not dominate daily life in China as it does in some other cultures. Unlike certain Christian traditions where a personal, heartfelt love for God is central, Chinese religion remained more formal, ritualistic, and less about personal devotion or emotional connection with the divine being. Over time, as ancestor worship's grip weakened and modern ideas spread, many people began to drift toward agnosticism, leaving behind much of the traditional religious framework. Alongside these broader religious beliefs, superstition permeated every aspect of Chinese life, shaping customs, daily actions, and the way people understood the world around them. The variety of superstitions was vast and sometimes very specific to regions or local cultures, but nearly everyone shared a belief in the powerful influence of spirits, both good and evil, especially those of departed ancestors. The calendar was filled with days considered lucky or unlucky, which dictated when people could marry, start business, or hold ceremonies. Natural phenomena like eclipses were not seen as simple astronomical events, but were explained by legends, such as a dragon trying to devour the sun or moon. The rainbow was thought to be caused by the meeting of impure vapors from the sun and earth, showing how ancient peoples tried to explain the world through myth and symbolism. To protect themselves and their homes, people relied on various amulets and charms believed to bring good luck or keep evil away. Sprigs of artemisia, a fragrant plant, were hung near beds to ward off sickness, while peach blossoms adorned lintels as symbols of happiness and prosperity. Both children and adults wore locks on chains around their necks, a practice called locking to life, intended to preserve health and vitality. Old brass mirrors were treasured for their supposed power to cure insanity, while figures of gourds, tiger claws, or mythical creatures like the unicorn served as talismans to attract fortune or repel misfortune. Written spells were common, often composed of characters symbolizing happiness or long life, and these spells might be worn on the body, written on paper or cloth, or burned with the ashes turned into medicinal decoctions for the young or ill. Divination, the art of seeking guidance or answers from unseen forces, had a long history in China, dating back thousands of years. The use of divining stalks made from the milfoil plant and tortoise shells was not originally for predicting the future in the sense we think of today, but was used to resolve doubts or make decisions, similar to how Western cultures might toss coins or draw lots. These practices were closely linked with the belief in fate and cosmic order, offering a way for people to feel they had some control or understanding of events beyond their power. One of the most influential doctrines in Chinese thought was feng shui, literally meaning wind and water. It was an ancient art that guided people on how to arrange homes and gravesites to harmonize with the flow of cosmic energy or qi. Rooted in ancestor worship and Taoist philosophy, feng shui sought to balance the forces of yin and yang and align human dwellings with natural and cosmic currents to promote health, prosperity, and peace. This practice became especially important during the Song dynasty when scholars and philosophers formalized many of its principles. Feng shui influenced not only architecture and town planning, but also everyday decisions about where to live, how to build, and even how to position furniture. Turning to knowledge and learning, it is clear that traditional Chinese education was overwhelmingly literary and focused on the study of classical texts. This emphasis shaped the culture's relationship with knowledge and science. Unlike Western societies where scientific inquiry developed alongside philosophy and religion, in China, knowledge classified under science in the West was of limited interest, except where it served practical needs. For instance, astronomy, or more accurately astrology, was studied primarily to regulate the calendar, which was crucial for timing agricultural activities. Farmers depended on knowing the right times to plant and harvest, so this knowledge was practical and vital, not theoretical. Other sciences, such as medicine, mathematics, and engineering, were pursued only to the extent that they solved real problems or improved everyday life. While Chinese inventors created many useful tools and techniques, scientific curiosity for its own sake was not the driving force behind learning. The education system focused mainly on mastering the classics, which prepared students for official examinations and government service rather than encouraging broad exploration of natural phenomena. This literary tradition remained dominant for centuries, reinforcing the value placed on moral and social order rather than experimental science. In summary, the spiritual and intellectual life of traditional China was deeply rooted in ancestor worship, Taoist and Buddhist teachings, and a vast array of superstitions and rituals that shaped daily behavior and cultural identity. While Confucianism provided the social framework and moral ideals, popular religion and superstition filled the spiritual and emotional gaps. At the same time, knowledge and learning were largely directed toward maintaining social harmony and fulfilling practical needs rather than scientific discovery. This unique blend created a culture rich in tradition and symbolism, where the invisible forces of spirits and cosmic energy were believed to influence every aspect of life, and where the past and present were constantly connected through rituals, customs, and the pursuit of balance and harmony. The foundation of Chinese society and culture was deeply rooted in the land and the food that sustained its people. Long before rice became the staple it is known for today, the diet consisted mainly of various fruits and different kinds of meat and fish, which formed the basis of their nourishment and survival. Over time, rice cultivation spread and became universally accepted as the primary source of sustenance, changing not only eating habits but also influencing social structures and daily life. Alongside this agricultural evolution, the intellectual history of China unfolded through two major periods of philosophical activity that deeply shaped the culture's worldview. The first significant era began around the 6th century BC, marked by the teachings of two great thinkers, Lao Tzu and Confucius, who laid the foundation for Taoism and Confucianism, philosophies that would dominate Chinese thought for centuries. This era continued until it was abruptly halted by the infamous burning of the books under the first emperor, Shi Huangdi, in 213 BC, an event that sought to suppress dissenting ideas and unify thought under the imperial regime. After this suppression, a second flowering of philosophical work emerged much later, starting with Zhou Zu in the early 11th century AD and lasting until Chu Shi in the 12th century. These thinkers further developed orthodox learning, reinforcing Confucian values and shaping the moral and intellectual fabric of society. By 190 BC, the Imperial Library had amassed a vast collection of knowledge, containing 2,705 volumes authored by 137 scholars, highlighting the importance placed on preserving written works and classical learning. However, this intense focus on literary and moral education centered on orthodox texts came at a cost. The fixation on classical scholarship and the rigid testing system used for appointing government officials stifled the growth of scientific inquiry and practical knowledge. As a result, even after more than 4 millennia of cultural development, by the time of the Manchu dynasty, the last of the monarchical regimes, the educated elite, though masters of literature and history, had only rudimentary understanding of many scientific fields. Their grasp of geography, mathematics, chemistry, botany, and geology was often described by outsiders as crude, vague, and lacking in critical analysis or systematic generalization. The progress of medicine was similarly hindered by deeply ingrained superstitions and misconceptions about the human body. For example, it was commonly believed that the intellect resided in the stomach, thoughts originated in the heart, breath was seated in the pit of the stomach, and the soul dwelled in the liver. These beliefs were partly based on the fear that dissecting a body would permanently damage it, even in the afterlife, thus preventing anatomical study and scientific advancement. Much of the scientific knowledge that was eventually gained came through European influence during the later years of imperial rule, especially in the 19th and early 20th centuries. This external instruction sparked a wave of modernization in philosophy and science, setting in motion profound changes that continue to affect China and the world today. The Chinese language itself reflects the complexity and continuity of the civilization. Originally, the language consisted of words with many syllables, but over time it evolved into a form characterized by monosyllabic words with isolating features, meaning that the grammatical role of a word depended mostly on its position within a sentence rather than on inflections or endings. Early on, various regional vernaculars developed across the vast country, eventually giving rise to numerous dialects with distinct pronunciations and tonal patterns. These tones, variations in pitch used to differentiate meaning, became a defining characteristic of the language, allowing words that sounded otherwise identical to convey completely different meanings depending on how they were spoken. Contrary to some beliefs, these tonal distinctions were not intentionally invented to separate similar sounds, but arose naturally over time as the language changed. This created a situation where a single syllable like ma could mean an exclamation, hemp, horse, or a curse, simply based on its intonation. Despite the language's complexity, it remained in a relatively primitive grammatical state, lacking inflection, declension, or clear parts of speech like those found in many Western languages. The usual sentence structure followed a clear order. The subject came first, followed by the predicate, which gave meaning to the sentence through word order and context rather than through changes to the words themselves. The interplay between the agricultural base, philosophical thought, and linguistic development paints a picture of a civilization that prized tradition, continuity, and order. While the literary and moral teachings were preserved with great zeal, they limited the advancement of science and broader knowledge in ways that only began to change with increasing contact with the West. This tension between respect for ancient learning and the need for new ideas set the stage for modern China's complex journey of reform and progress. Through it all, the Chinese language, rich in nuance and history, remained a living symbol of a culture deeply connected to its past, yet facing the future with growing curiosity and openness. The structure of the Chinese language follows a pattern where the order of words in a sentence is usually subject, verb, complement direct, and then complement indirect. Gender in the language is created using specific small words called particles that mark whether something is masculine or feminine. When it comes to number, which shows whether something is singular or plural, numerals are placed in front of nouns to indicate this. Cases, which show the role a noun plays in a sentence, are not marked by changing the noun itself, but by their position in the sentence, or by adding certain prepositions before them. Adjectives, the words that describe nouns, come before the nouns they describe, and the way these adjectives are arranged in a sentence can change their meaning, especially when showing comparison, like bigger or smaller. One challenge in the Chinese language is that punctuation was historically absent, which sometimes made it difficult to understand the exact meaning of written text. However, modern printed works have started to include punctuation, which helps reduce confusion and make reading easier. Alongside these structural features, new educational developments have introduced many new words and phrases into the Chinese language that were not found in older literature or dictionaries. Interestingly, some of these new expressions come from Japanese idioms, which are being brought into the Chinese language, causing it to lose some of its original purity or traditional form. The written Chinese language itself is a well-known marvel, admired by many as a thing of beauty and a lasting joy for those who can appreciate its artistry. It is said that writing first began with simple knotted cords used to record information, which then evolved into marks or notches carved on pieces of wood. These marks probably started more as a way to count or keep track of numbers, rather than to write words as we know them today. Over time, these symbols developed into crude outlines of objects seen in nature, and then eventually into a phonetic system where each written character has two parts, the radical, which gives a hint about the meaning, and the phonetic part, which suggests how it is pronounced. These characters are unique symbols that do not join together to form longer words and do not change their form to show tense or number. Traditionally, the characters are written in vertical columns, which probably comes from the ancient practice of painting or carving them on strips of bark or bamboo that were arranged vertically. Moving beyond language, the achievements of the Chinese people throughout history are impressive and varied. After initially living in simple nests to protect themselves from wild animals and then moving into caves, they eventually built houses and palaces based on those early designs. Their traditional homes typically have a flat wall at the back and openings or doors at the front. The walls are not built first. Instead, the pillars and the main roof frame are constructed initially, and then walls are added afterward. Side buildings or outbuildings are attached to these main structures as additional space. A common feature found in the northern provinces is the ka-ong, or stove bed, now usually a brick platform, but originally a hollow dug into the side of a cave with an opening underneath where a fire could be lit during cold winters to provide warmth. Windows and shutters in these traditional buildings open upwards, a style that has survived from the mats or shades once hung over the openings of cave dwellings to block sunlight or wind. Usually, 4 of these buildings face each other around a square yard, forming a courtyard, and sometimes there are multiple courtyards grouped together to make a larger compound for a family or community. The Chinese have been resourceful in their diet, eating almost every kind of food they could find on land, beneath it, or in water, though milk was generally not part of their diet historically. Their main foods include rice, chicken, fish, various vegetables such as garlic and tea, which became a widely consumed beverage over time. In earlier periods, they also ate meat and drank wine, occasionally in large amounts before tea became popular. When it comes to clothing, they started by covering themselves with animal skins and feathers and later developed fine textiles like silk and satin. However, cotton became the most common fabric used, and wool was rarely worn. During the Manchu dynasty, the dominant style of dress reflected the culture of this horse-riding people, with clothing designed to resemble aspects of the noble horse itself. For example, broad sleeves were meant to symbolize hooves, and the queue, or long braided hair, represented the horse's mane. This queue was created by shaving the front part of the scalp while leaving the hair at the back to grow long and be braided. Unlike ancient Egyptians, who often wore wigs, the Chinese did not adopt this practice. They valued wearing their natural hair, styled in this traditional way as a symbol of their cultural identity. Their attention to clothing length was notable. They usually preferred to wear long coats and looked down upon the shorter coats favored by Westerners, considering such styles less proper. This preference for long garments was part of their respect for tradition and modesty, showing their sense of dignity in how they presented themselves. Despite this, in more recent times, some have paradoxically chosen to adopt Western-style clothing, blending old customs with new influences, reflecting the changes taking place in their society as it moves toward modernization. The Chinese people have always taken pride in their clothing, almost always choosing to wear their coats long and loose, a style that reflected both their culture and their values, showing respect for tradition and a sense of dignity in appearance. They often looked down upon Westerners for wearing short coats, which they considered improper or careless. Yet, in a strange twist of fate, they have recently begun to adopt the Western style of dress themselves, a paradox that highlights the complex relationship between tradition and modernity in their society. Beyond clothing, their achievements in engineering and construction have been remarkable and deeply rooted in their long history. They built extensive canal systems to connect rivers and regions, facilitating trade and travel across vast distances. Their bridges and aqueducts, some spanning great lengths and heights, stand as testaments to their skill in architecture and water management, reflecting both functionality and beauty. Among their most famous constructions is the Great Wall, a monumental feat of human labor and ingenuity, stretching across thousands of miles. Despite popular myths, the wall is not visible from the moon or even from very far away. it is simply too narrow and blends with the natural terrain, much like a single hair would be invisible from 100 yards. Nevertheless, its length and purpose, defense and control remain extraordinary. The Chinese also constructed wide roads that connected their vast empire, though for centuries maintenance was neglected, allowing many roads to fall into disrepair. Recently, with the rise of commerce and the introduction of vehicles powered by oil or electricity, there has been renewed interest and effort in building and maintaining these vital routes, indicating a shift toward modernization and economic growth. In the urban centers and countryside alike, the Chinese created honorary portals dedicated to chaste widows, symbolizing virtue and social values. They built pagodas, elegant multi-tiered towers often associated with Buddhist temples that added to the spiritual and cultural landscape. Arched bridges of great beauty spanned rivers and valleys, combining artistic grace with practical use. Each city was typically surrounded by a tall and strong wall designed to protect its inhabitants from enemies and invaders, showing the importance placed on security and community defense throughout their history. The range of implements and weapons crafted by the Chinese people was vast and diverse. Everyday tools like pens, fans, and chopsticks were made with care and skill, reflecting the subtle beauty found in ordinary life. Agricultural tools such as plows and carts helped sustain their large population by making farming more efficient. Their naval engineering produced ships capable of long voyages and trade, extending their influence beyond the mainland. On the battlefield, the Chinese developed an array of weapons and war machines. Fiery darts and flame elephants, devices designed to project fire at enemies, were part of their early arsenal. Archers wielded bows and spears, and soldiers used spiked chariots to break enemy lines. They also built battering rams and hurling engines, such as mangonels and trebuchets, to attack fortifications, showing advanced knowledge of siege warfare. Later, they introduced firearms, including matchlocks made from wrought iron, with long barrels resting on wooden stocks for stability, as well as gingals, which were enormous firearms about 14 feet long, mounted on tripods for support and accuracy. Soldiers protected themselves with cuirasses made from quilted cotton cloth studded with brass knobs for defense, and wore helmets crafted from iron or polished steel, sometimes intricately inlaid, equipped with neck and ear covers to guard against blows. Despite this wide range of weaponry and tools, the Chinese traditionally remained content with their designs, rarely seeking to improve or innovate upon them in any significant way for many centuries. However, in more recent times, influenced by Western technology and industrial methods, they have begun producing newer patterns of weapons and implements in their own factories, showing a readiness to embrace modernization while preserving some of their traditional craftsmanship. Their cultural achievements are equally impressive, especially their literary heritage, which ranks among the greatest and most remarkable accumulations in the world. Over thousands of years, countless volumes of history, philosophy, poetry, and art have been written, preserving the thoughts and experiences of generations. In addition to literature, the Chinese have excelled in producing fine porcelain, renowned for its delicate craftsmanship, exquisite designs, and enduring beauty, making it highly prized both at home and abroad. In music, their accomplishments, while present, have not reached the heights of refinement found in other arts, though certain traditional forms continue to be valued for their cultural significance. Painting has flourished in various styles, producing magnificent works that capture nature, people, and spiritual themes with skill and elegance. However, their achievements in sculpture and large-scale architecture have been relatively limited, with few lasting monuments that compare to those of other great civilizations. Overall, the Chinese legacy reflects a blend of deep respect for tradition, remarkable skill in arts and crafts, and a complex relationship with change and progress, all of which continue to shape their identity in the modern world.